Mr. President, honourable members of the European Parliament, when I stood before you this time last year, I had a somewhat easier speech to give. It was plain for all to see that our Union was not in a good state. Europe was battered and bruised by a year that shook our very foundation. We only had two choices: either come together around a positive European agenda or each retreat into our own corners. Faced with this choice, I argued for unity. I proposed a positive agenda to help create, as I said last year, a Europe that protects, a Europe that empowers, a Europe that defends. Over the past 12 months, the European Parliament has helped bring this agenda to life. We continue to make progress with each passing day. Just last night, you worked to find an agreement on trade defence instrument and on doubling our European investment capacity, and you succeeded. Thank you for that. I also want to thank the 27 leaders of our member states. Days after my speech last year, they welcomed my agenda at their summit in Bratislava. In doing so, they chose unity. They chose to rally around our common ground. Together, we showed that Europe can deliver for its citizens when and where it matters. Ever since, we've been slowly but surely gathering momentum. It helped that the economic outlook swung in our favour. We are now in the 5th year of an economic recovery that really reaches every single member state. Growth in the European Union has outstripped that of the United States over the last 2 years. It now stands above 2% for the Union as a whole and at 2.2% for the monetary area. Unemployment is at a 9-year low. Almost 8 million jobs have been created during this mandate so far. With 235 million people at work, more people are in employment in the European Union than ever before. The European Commission cannot take the credit for this alone, though I'm sure that had 8 million jobs been lost, we would have taken the blame. But Europe's institutions played their part in helping the wind change. We can take credit for our European investment plan, which has triggered 225 billion worth of investment so far. It has granted loans to over 450,000 small firms and more than 270 infrastructure projects. We can take credit for the fact that, thanks to determined action, European banks once again have the capital firepower to lend to companies so that they can grow and create jobs. And we can take credit for having brought public deficits down from 6.6% to 1.6%. This is thanks to an intelligent application of the Stability and Growth Pact. We ask for fiscal discipline, but are careful not to kill growth. This is in fact working very well across the Union, despite some criticism. 10 years since crisis struck, Europe's economy is finally bouncing back, and with it, our confidence. Our 27 leaders, the Parliament and the Commission are putting the Europe back in our Union, and together we are putting the Union back into our Union. In the last year, we saw all 27 leaders walk up to the Capitol Hill in Rome, one by one, to renew their vows to each other and to our Union. All of this leads me to believe the wind is back in Europe's sails. We have now a window of opportunity, but it will not stay open forever. Let us make the most of the momentum, catch the wind in our sails. For this, we must do two things. First, we should stay the course set out last year. We have still 16 months in which real progress can be made by Parliament, Council and Commission. We must use this time to finish what we started in Bratislava and deliver on our own positive agenda. Secondly, we should chart the direction for the future. As Mark Twain wrote, I'm quoting, "Years from now, we'll be more disappointed by the things we did not do than by those we did." Now is the time to build a more united, a stronger, a more democratic Europe for 2025. Monsieur le Président,
President, ladies and gentlemen, members of the Parliament, while we look towards the future, we cannot lose our direction. Together, we have set ourselves the objective of achieving an energy union, a security union, a capital markets union, a banking union, and a digital single market. Together, we've already travelled far on this road. As the Parliament has said, the Commission has already presented 80% of the proposals that were set out at the beginning of the mandate. We now have to work together in order to ensure that these proposals become legislative acts and that these acts are made concrete in practice. Now, as is ever the case, some concessions will have to be made. The proposals put forward by the Commission to reform our common asylum system or to set up new solid rules on the posting of workers are, of course, and I know this, controversial issues. We will get good results if everyone builds their part of the bridge so that we can meet. And I would like to say that the Commission is open to compromise, starting from the moment that the final result is good for the Union and fair for all of its member states. We are now ready to submit the remaining 20% of the initiatives by May 2018. Now, this morning I spoke to the President of the European Parliament, Iona Tajani, and the Prime Minister Jüri Ratas of Estonia, and I sent a letter of intention which sets out the priorities for the upcoming year. I don't want, and indeed I cannot here enumerate all of these proposals, but do allow me perhaps to mention 5 which are particularly important. First, I would like us to reinforce, to strengthen our European trade programme. Europe is open to trade, yes, but there has to be reciprocity. We have to get as much as what we give. Trade is not an abstract concept. Trade, it's jobs. Trade is new opportunities for European businesses, whether they're large scale or small. Every billion in export that we have equals 14,000 extra jobs in Europe. Trade is also exporting our social and environmental norms and our rules in terms of the protection of data and food safety. Europe has always been an attractive economic space, but since last year I see that our partners all over the world are knocking at our door in order to sign trade agreements with us. Thanks to the help of this Parliament, we've just concluded a trade agreement with Canada, which will be provisionally applicable starting next week. We found a political agreement with Japan on a new future economic partnership, and by the end of this year we have a very good chance to achieve the same with Mexico, and the countries of South America. Today, we're suggesting that we open trade negotiations with Australia and with New Zealand. I would like all of these agreements to be finalised by the end of our mandate, and I am absolutely committed to them being negotiated in the greatest transparency. This opening to exchanges has to go hand in hand with increased transparency for our decision-making processes. The European Parliament will have the last word on all of these trade agreements. Therefore, its members, just like national and regional parliaments, have to be kept absolutely up to speed and informed starting from the very first day of negotiation, and the Commission will oversee this. From now on, the Commission will publish all of the draft negotiation mandates, which it will present to the Council. The citizen has the right to know what the Commission is putting forward. We have finished with the lack of transparency. We're going to finish with rumours and ideas of intention that the complaints that the Commission very often is being the subject of.
Je voudrais dire une fois pour toutes.
I'd like to say once and for all that we are not naive supporters of free exchange. Europe has always got to defend its strategic interests. This is why we suggest today a new framework for the EU on how we examine investments. In English, it's called investment screening. If a public business, a foreign public business, wants to buy a strategic European port, part of our energy infrastructure, or one of our businesses in for example, defense technology, that can only happen in full transparency via a deep examination and debate. This is our political responsibility to know what is happening here in order to be able, if we need, to protect our collective security. Secondly, the Commission wants to make our industry stronger and more competitive. This is particularly true for our industrial base and the 32 million workers who make up its backbone. They make the first-class products, our cars, for example, which explains where we are ahead of others. I am proud of our car industry, but I am shocked when clients and consumers are intentionally tricked. I therefore invite the automobile industry to make a proper amends for that and to correct what they're doing, rather than trying to trick and to lead people into error. The car constructors ought to invest in clean cars, which are those of the future.
Ladies
and gentlemen, we are going to present today a new industrial strategy for Europe, which will allow our industry to remain and become the very first in the area of innovation, digitalization and decarbonisation. Thirdly, I want Europe to be in the vanguard of the fight against climate change. Last year, we set global climate norms with the ratification of the Paris Agreement, indeed in this very assembly. Confronted by the reduction of the ambitions which the United States has shown, Europe is going to work to ensure that the planet remains great and it remains the indivisible homeland of all humanity. The Commission will shortly present a proposal to reduce carbon in the transport sector. Fourthly, I want us to protect better Europeans in the digital area. During the past 3 years, we have made progress in the securitization of the internet. There have been new rules put forward by the Commission which will protect our intellectual property, our cultural diversity, and our private personal data. We have strengthened the struggle against terrorist propaganda and online radicalization. But Europe remains poorly equipped, confronted by cyber attacks. Cyber attacks are sometimes more dangerous for the stability of democracy and economies than guns and tanks. Only last year, we have noted more than 4,000 attacks by cyberware, and 80% of European enterprises have known at least one incident linked to cyber safety. These cyber attacks do not know borders, and they spare nobody. This is why the Commission is proposing today new tools, and particularly a European cybersecurity agency to better defend us against these attacks. And fifth, migration remains on our radar. Even if the questions around migration have often created debate and polemic, we have managed to make real progress on numerous fronts. Today we protect the external frontiers in a more efficient manner. More than 1,700 officers of the new border guards and the coast guards work with 100,000 national border guards in all the member states and work in Greece and Italy, Bulgaria and Spain. We have common borders with the states who are not in the very front line of the geographic situation. They must not be left alone for their protection. We have to have common frontiers and common protection. We have managed to slow down the flows of irregular migrants, which is the source of great worry in many countries. We have reduced the number of irregular arrivals by 97% in the Eastern Mediterranean, thanks to the agreement that we drew up with Turkey. And this summer, we managed to better control the Central Mediterranean routes. The arrivals have gone down by 81% in August compared to the same month last year. In this way, we have considerably reduced the number of human lives lost in the Mediterranean. I can't talk about migration without making a heartfelt homage to Italy for its perseverance and its generosity.
Pendant les mois d'été,
during the summer months, the Commission worked in harmony with the Prime Minister, my friend Paolo Gentiloni, and his government. We did it and we'll continue to do it because in the Mediterranean, Italy is saving the honour of Europe. We have also and urgently improved the living conditions of the refugees in Libya. I am upset by the terribly inhuman conditions which we see in the reception centres. Here, Europe has got a collective responsibility, and the Commission will work hand in hand with the United Nations to bring to an end this scandalous situation which cannot continue.
même si cela m'attriste,
Even if it saddens me that not all of our member states show the same degree of solidarity, Europe as a whole has continued to show solidarity. Only last year, our member states gave asylum to over 720,000 refugees, or have foreseen how they would be replaced. This is 3 times more than Australia, Canada and the United States together. Europe, contrary to what is often said, is not a fortress and must never become one. Europe is and will remain the a continent of solidarity where people have to be able to find asylum if people are being pursued for unacceptable reasons. And I'm particularly proud of those young Europeans who are volunteering to give language courses to Syrian refugees, or to all those young people who, by their thousands, have joined our new European Solidarity Corps. These young people give both life and colour to European solidarity.
Mais nous devons redoubler d'efforts.
But today we've got to double our efforts. Before the end of the month, the Commission will present a new series of proposals focused on returns, solidarity with Africa, and the opening up of paths of legal migration. In particular, when it comes to the issue of returns, I want to repeat this. Those who have no right to stay in Europe have got to go back to their country of origin. Only 36% of migrants in irregular situation are sent back. It is obvious that we have to considerably strengthen our activities in this area. This is the only way that Europe will be able to show proof of solidarity with regard to the refugees who really need protection.
La solidarité ne peut pas être.
Solidarity cannot be an exclusively intra-European issue. It's also about putting in place greater solidarity with Africa. Africa, cradle of humanity, a noble continent, a young continent. Our Trust Fund for Africa, which has been filled with 2.7 billion euros, opens the possibilities of jobs all over the African continent. But while the budget of the EU is carrying the weight of the financing, the contribution of all of our member states is only at 150 million euros. So the trust is now getting to its limits. We have to know the risks of there being a lack of financing. In 2015, many migrants wanted to get to Europe when and because the food funds of the UN ran out. I therefore want to invite the member states to join action towards and to ensure that the Trust Fund for Africa does not suffer the same fate, because the risk is great.
Nous allons aussi travailler à l'ouverture.
We are also going to work towards the opening of legal migration routes. Irregular migration will only stop when the migrants have got another option than undertaking a perilous journey.
Nous sommes sur le point de réinstaller.
We're on the point of setting up 22,000 refugees coming from Turkey, Jordan and Lebanon, and I am actually supporting also the High Commissioner of the Nations for the reinstallation of 40,000 other refugees from Libya and neighbouring countries. For the rest, Europe is a continent which is getting older, and this is another reason for having a legal migration system, which is an absolute necessity. This is why the Commission has put forward proposals to facilitate access for migrants to the European Blue Card, and I want to thank the support of the Parliament for this proposal.
Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, honourable members, I have just listed a small number of initiatives that we want to complete by the end of next year. And we have to do that. But even that is not enough if we're to win the hearts and minds of the people of Europe. The time has come to set the course for the future. In March, the Commission published its white paper on the future of Europe with 5 different scenarios, setting out how Europe might look in 2025. These scenarios were debated, sometimes superficially, sometimes in depth. They were analyzed, and sometimes they were torn apart. And that is the way things should be, because that's what they were for. We have to set in train a process which will allow the people of Europe themselves to determine their future. The future of Europe is not something that can be dictated from above. Any such decision must be based on a broad consensus in the wake of democratic debate. This House has made an active contribution to this debate, and I'd like to thank all of the rapporteurs concerned. I'd also like to thank those members who've taken part in the more than 2,000 public stakeholder consultations which the Commission has organized around Europe since March. The time has come, ladies and gentlemen, to draw the first conclusions from this debate. The time has come to take the next step from reflection to action, from debate to decision. Let me now set out the way I see things. You're about to hear my very personal scenario number 6. This is born out of decades of personal experience. I have lived the European project through my entire life. I have fought for it, I have worked for it. I've been through good times and I've been through bad times. I've sat on various sides of the negotiating table, as minister, as prime minister, as president of the Eurogroup, and now as president of the European Commission. I was there at Maastricht, at Amsterdam, Nice and Lisbon, where our union developed and expanded. I have always fought for Europe. I have sometimes suffered with Europe and agonized over Europe. I have been through thick and thin with the European Union, and never have I lost my love for the European Union. As we all know, there is no love without disappointment, or very rarely. Love for Europe, I mean what I say, because the European Union has achieved so much in this divided world. Inward and outward peace, prosperity, not for all but still for many. In 2018, we should consider what it means to have a European Year of Cultural Heritage and celebrate our cultural diversity. Europe is a Europe of values and a safe place for us to be. Europe is more than the single market, than money, than the euro. It's all about values. There are 3 fundamental principles which underpin my scenario number 6: freedom, equality of opportunity, and the rule of law. First and foremost, Europe is a union of freedom. And by that I mean freedom from oppression and dictatorship. Those are phenomena that our continent, especially its central and eastern parts, have known all too well. And I mean the freedom
Eine Freiheit.
And I mean the freedom to speak our minds, whether as citizens or as journalists. This is not to be taken for granted, and yet it is these values of freedom upon which our union is built. Freedom is not something handed down to us. We have to fight for it in Europe and in the world. Europe must be a union of equality and equality of opportunity. That means equality between its members, be they big, be they small, be they in the east, the west, the north, or the south. Europe stretches from Vigo to Varna, from Spain to Bulgaria.
Europa muss mit
Europe needs to breathe with both its lungs, the eastern lung and the western lung. Otherwise, our continent will suffocate. In a union of equality, there cannot be second-class citizens. It is unacceptable that in 2017, children are dying in Europe from diseases which should have been eradicated long ago.
Kinder in
Children in Romania and children in Italy should have the same access to measles vaccines like children in other European countries, with no ifs and no buts.
Deshalb
And that is why we are working together with all of the member states to support their national vaccination programs. There must not be avoidable deaths in our Europe.
in einer Union der Gleichheit
In a Europe of equality, there cannot be second-class workers. People doing the same work in the same place should receive the same remuneration.
diesem Ziel
That is what is behind the Commission's proposals on the posting of workers. We need to make sure that all EU rules on worker mobility are implemented fairly, simply and effectively. And for that, we need a new European Supervisory and Implementation Authority. It is absurd for us to have a banking supervisory authority making sure that banking standards are respected when we don't have a common labour market authority which makes sure that the single market is built on fairness.
wir werden diese
We are going to set up such an authority. In a union of equality, there can be no second-class consumers. I, for one, cannot accept that people, especially in Central and Eastern Europe, are buying poorer quality products which have the same packaging and the same label as those sold in other countries. A Slovak deserves to have as much fish in fish fingers as anyone else. A Hungarian should have as much meat in meat dishes as anyone else, and Czechs should have as much cocoa in their chocolate as anyone else. These practices are already forbidden by EU law, and we have to make sure that that EU law is enforced, and we need to ensure the national authorities have the wherewithal to root out these practices. In Europe, law has muscle. It's not muscle that lays down the law. And that means that in Europe, the law is safeguarded by an independent judiciary. Being part of a union which is built on the rule of law means respecting court judgments. Our member states have given the European Court of Justice the powers to take the ultimate decision, and that means ECJ judgments have to be respected in all cases. Failing to respect them and undermining national justice systems means stealing citizens' fundamental rights. In the European Union, the rule of law is not optional. It's a duty. Our union is not a state, but it's still governed by the rule of law. These three principles: freedom, equality of opportunity and rule of law have to remain the foundation of our ever stronger and ever more united and more democratic union. For the people of Europe, what they're looking for is not new treaties, new institutions. They're a means to an end. New institutions, new treaties are perhaps of interest to us here in Strasbourg or in Brussels. Elsewhere, people don't care two hoots. I'm only interested in institutional reform if it gives us a more efficient union. One day there will be treaty change, but to busy ourselves with that now means first and foremost that we have to understand that democracy is based on compromise, not winners and losers. If we have the right compromises, everyone is a winner. In the European Union, compromises are neither bad nor ugly. Compromises are an art, a way of bridging differences and finding our way to one another. People who struggle with compromises struggle with democracy and struggle with Europe.
Ihre Einheit zu stärken,
If we are to have a stronger European Union, it needs to be more inclusive too. If we want to bolster our external borders, and rightly so, then it is high time to bring Romania and Bulgaria into the Schengen area.
im Übrigen
And incidentally, Croatia too deserves full membership of the Schengen area as soon as all of the criteria are met.
wenn wir wollen,
If we want the euro to unite our continent rather than dividing it, then it needs to be more than just the currency of a select group of countries. The euro is destined to be the common currency of the entire European Union. All but 2 member states are duty-bound to join the euro area as soon as they've met the conditions. For that to be possible, these member states need the support of a euro accession instrument, which I propose here today, which will offer pre-accession assistance in technical and financial form. If we want the continent's banks to operate by the same rules and under the same supervision, then we should encourage all member states to accede to the banking union. That means we must reduce the remaining risks in the banking systems of certain member states. The banking union will only work if risk reduction and risk mitigation goes hand in hand. For us to be able to ensure that that is the case, a certain number of preconditions have to be in place, as proposed by the Commission in November 2015. We can only have a common deposit guarantee scheme when all of the member states have done their homework. If we want to see an end to social fragmentation and social dumping in Europe, the member states, as soon as possible, and at the latest by the Gothenburg summit in November, should agree on the European Pillar of Social Rights. National social security systems are going to continue to have their differences and will continue to be separate, but we should still at least agree on a European Union of social standards to ensure that we have a consensus about what is socially fair and what isn't socially fair on our single market.
Ich bleibe davon überzeugt, damit Europa gelingt,
a successful Europe must not give workers the cold shoulder. Ladies and gentlemen, if we want to have greater stability in our neighborhood, then we need to offer a credible enlargement prospect to the countries of the Western Balkans. During the term of office of this Commission and this Parliament, there will be no new accessions because the conditions for accession will not have been met. However, in future, the European Union will have more than 27 member states. In the case of all accession countries, the rule of law, justice and fundamental values have top priority in the negotiations. And that rules out EU membership for Turkey in the foreseeable future. For some considerable time, Turkey has been moving away from the European Union in leaps and bounds. Journalists belong in editorial offices amidst a heated debate and not in prison. I appeal today to the powers that be in Turkey. Let our journalists go, and not just our journalists. Stop calling our member states and our heads of state and government fascists and Nazis. Europe is a continent of mature democracies. Those who knowingly offend pull up the drawbridge. And sometimes I have the impression that there are those in Turkey who want to pull up the drawbridge and later blame the European Union for the failure of accession negotiations. From our side, there will always be an outstretched hand, outstretched to the great people of Turkey and all of those who are willing to work with us on the basis of our shared values. Ladies and gentlemen, honourable members, I would like to see our union stronger, and that means it needs a stronger single market. In matters of the single market, we need more frequent and simpler decision-making on the basis of a qualified majority with a European Parliament co-decision. And that doesn't necessitate treaty change. The existing treaties contain bridging clauses which make it possible to decide in Council on the basis of qualified majority, as long as this is decided in advance by unanimity in the European Council. I'm thinking in terms of decisions about value-added tax, fair taxation of the digital economy, and the financial transaction tax. These can all be decided by qualified majority. Europe needs to be able to take decisions more rapidly and more efficiently. We need to see a more agile economic and monetary union. The euro area is more resistant to shocks than it was a few years ago. We have a European stability mechanism, which I believe should gradually be turned into a European monetary fund that needs to be anchored in the European Union. There will be specific proposals coming from the Commission in December of this year to that effect. We need a European Minister of Economy and Finance, a minister to promote structural reform in our member states, a minister who can build on the work done in the Commission by its special unit for structural reform support. The European Minister of Economy and Finance should coordinate all EU financing instruments and step in whenever a member state is facing the threat of recession or fundamental crisis. And here I'm not calling for a new position. For efficiency reasons, I believe that the future commissioner responsible for economy and finance, ideally a vice president of the European Commission, carry out this role, as well as chairing the Eurogroup. The European Minister of Economy and Finance must, of course, be accountable to the European Parliament. We do not need parallel structures. We do not need a separate Euro budget. We need a strong Eurozone budget line within the existing EU budget.
Ich kann auch der Idee
Nor do I see great merit in the idea of a separate Euro Parliament. The Parliament of the Euro area is this one, the European Parliament.
Die Europäische Union
The European Union also needs to be stronger in how it fights terrorism. In the last 3 years, a great deal has already been done, but we're still not reacting quickly enough in the case of cross-border terror threats. I therefore plead for the setting up of a European investigating body that would make sure that data on terrorists and foreign fighters are automatically exchanged between our intelligence and police services.
aus meiner Sicht
I also believe that there is reason enough for the newly set up European Public Prosecutor to be responsible for the prosecution of cross-border terrorist crimes. The European Union should also have more influence on the world stage, but it needs to be able to take its foreign policy decisions more swiftly. I think the time has come to take foreign policy decisions in certain cases by qualified majority, and that is allowed under the existing treaties as long as there is a unanimous decision by the European Council, and there is reason to do that. It would make our work more efficient. In the field of defence, more efforts are required. The setting up of a European Defence Fund is on our agenda. Permanent structured cooperation in the defence field is well on the way. By 2025, we will need a functioning European Defence Union. We need it, and NATO would like us to have it. The Union should continue to do what the Commission has sought to do lately, i.e. to concentrate on the important things. We shouldn't annoy the people of Europe with nitpicking and nitty-gritty. We need to act on the big things and keep away from the small things which can be dealt with by the member states. This Commission has tried to play a great role in the big things and to take a back seat on the small things. Each year it's put forward fewer than 25 new initiatives. Remember, the previous Commission was putting out more than 100. This month we're going to be setting up a subsidiarity and proportionality task force. The first Vice President, Frans Timmermans, has already done a good job of better lawmaking, and he's going to lead the new task force. The Timmermans task force will have among its members members of this Parliament and members of national parliaments. It will report in 1 year.
Monsieur le Président,
President, ladies and gentlemen, our union now needs to effect a democratic leap. I hope that European political parties will kick off their campaigns for the next elections earlier than they did in the past, because all too often European electoral campaigns have been reduced to a simple totting up of national electoral proposals, and European democracy deserves a lot more than that. Today, the Commission is setting out new rules on the funding of parties and political foundations. It's not a question of boosting the treasuries of the extremists that are against Europe. It's a question of allowing European parties to better structure themselves. I'm well aware that the idea is contested by a number of people, but I have to say that I have quite a lot of sympathy for the idea of having transnational lists for European elections. And I will try and convince the leader of my parliamentary group to try and follow this idea, because it will lead to more clarity and more democracy for our elections. I also think that over the next few months we should involve national parliaments and civil society at the national, regional and local level. We should involve them in the work that we're doing on the future of Europe. Over the last 3 years, members of the Commission have visited national parliaments more than 650 times. They participated in more than 300 meetings, talking to citizens in more than 80 cities in 27 member states. And that's why I support President Macron's idea of organising democratic conventions throughout Europe in 2018. As the debate develops, I will be attaching a great deal of importance personally to Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania and Romania in 2018, because 2018 is the year where these 4 countries will be celebrating their 100th birthday. Those who have the ambition to shape our future and our continent need to know about and honour our history, our joint history. And so the history of the 4 countries I mentioned also is part and parcel of that, of course. These are countries without which Europe would not be complete. This need to reinforce democracy and transparency obviously also has implications for the European Commission. Today, I am handing out to the European Parliament a new code of conduct for commissioners. First and foremost, this code of conduct specifies that commissioners can stand in European elections under perfectly normal conditions. Obviously, the new code will shore up the obligations of commissioners when it comes to integrity during and after their mandate. Whoever wants to boost European democracy could never accept that the major democratic progress inherent in the heads of list system, the Spitzenkandidaten system, would never go along with that not being renewed, because it was an innovation and led to more democracy. And I'm convinced, but myself, by the way, will not be a candidate, but I'm convinced that the future president will make the most of this experience.
Présentez-vous, mais vous ne serez
You can stand if you like, but you won't be elected.
plus de démocratie.
More democracy, that's what we need. And that means more efficiency, of course. European efficiency would be very much at an advantage if we were to merge together the presidencies of the European Commission and the European Council. That would lead to a massive boost in efficiency. This proposal does not target in any way my excellent friend Donald Tusk, who I have been working with very harmoniously for over the last 3 years, right from the start of our mandate. It is not, this proposal is not aimed at myself and it's not aimed at Donald, but all it does is ensure that the European landscape would be clearer and more understandable if the European ship was steered by one and the same captain at the helm. So if we just had a single president, it would better reflect the true nature of our European Union, which is a union of states and a union of citizens. Colleagues, the vision of a more unified Europe, a stronger Europe, a more democratic Europe, this is what I'm presenting to you today. And it involves all the different scenarios that I set out last March. But our future cannot remain a mere scenario, some kind of draft, one idea among many others. It's today that we have to start preparing our union of tomorrow. This morning, I sent President Tajani, President Tusk, and also to the future presidencies in Council of the Council from now until March 2019, I sent them a roadmap setting out the direction that we need to follow. And one important element in this is the budget that the Commission will be presenting in May 2018. There too, we have a choice to make here. Either we ensure that the European Union's ambitions are given a budget commensurate to those ambitions, and that is something that I'm very much in favour of. We shouldn't be making any cuts. That would be the other option, which I would not be in favour of. March 29th, 2019, that will be the date where the United Kingdom will leave the European Union. This will be a very sad and tragic moment in our history. We will always regret this, and I think that you will regret it as well soon, if I might say. Nonetheless, we have to respect the will of the British people. But we are going to make progress. We will keep moving. We will move on, because Brexit isn't everything. It's not the future of Europe. It's not the be-all and end-all. The 30th of March 2019, on that date, will be a union of 27. And I suggest that we prepare very well for that date. The European Parliament elections will have taken place just a few weeks later, in May 2019. That date will be a very important meeting with European democracy. We need to ensure that European citizens go to the ballot box having a very clear vision of the way in which the European Union will develop in the years to come. And that's why I am calling on President Tusk and on Romania, which will have the presidency during the first half of the year 2019, I want them to organise a special summit in Romania on the 30th of March 2019. And I would like that summit to be held in the magnificent ancient city of Sibiu, which I also know under the name of Hermannstadt. That would be the right moment to take very important decisions, essential decisions in fact, to shape Europe, a more united Europe, a stronger and more democratic Europe. My hope is that on the 30th of March 2019, Europeans will wake up in a union where they know that we're defending their values, where all member states vigorously respect the rule of law, where being a full member of the Eurozone, the banking union and the Schengen area have become a standard for every member state of the European Union. We need to ensure that we defend our single currency in all circumstances, good and bad, without having recourse to external aid. Our single market needs to be fairer for workers in the East and the West, and I hope that they will wake up in a world like that. We also need to agree on a bedrock of social standards where profits are taxed where they are generated, where terrorists find no fault lines to exploit, and where we will have agreed on the creation of a true European Defence Union. where a single president will be at the helm of the work of the Commission and the Council after having been elected in the wake of a pan-European electoral campaign. So yes, on the 30th of March 2019, our citizens will wake up in that kind of union. And if that's the case, they will need to take part in the elections, to vote. And they need to realise that our union is working for them. Ladies and gentlemen, Helmut Kohl and Jacques Delors taught me that Europe will only advance if it shows courage. The single market, the Schengen area, the single currency, all of these things were projects when they were first initiated or when they were first thought of as mere flights of fancy. But all those projects that I mentioned are a reality nowadays. So Europe is faring better now. And people are telling me one shouldn't overload our European ship. But at the same time, this stage that we have now reached dictates that we shouldn't be overcautious. It's not enough just to make minor repairs. What we should do today and tomorrow is patiently, step by step, from one inspiration to the next, moving onwards, and complete not just the roof of our European house, but proceed in building and completing all of the floors of that house. We need to finish the job as a whole. Now that the sun is shining, this is when we need to do it. Because when the next storm brews, and it certainly will, it will be too late. So let's raise anchor, let's get going, let's set sail, let's get going, and let's catch the wind in our sails. Thank you very much.
Grazie.
Thank you, President of the Commission. Thank you for your speech, which now gives us the opportunity to have an important debate on the future of our European Union. You have given us in this room very many elements for discussion of great interest, and we will listen now to the words of the representatives of the European citizens. As President of the Parliament, all I can do is to share your position on the need to have a more democratic Europe. I want to thank you for having underlined this necessity. I share and I thank you again for a number of the things that you said, more than one thing that you said, because you have repeated the positions of the Parliament on a number of key issues. The fact that the Parliament can also have its power of initiative, this is something that we want to count on the support of the Commission in order to be able to launch initiatives in areas of great importance. Thank you. And now I will give the floor to the chairs of the political groups. The first Mr. Weber for the EPP.
Europa braucht Mut.
Europe requires courage, it requires optimism and creativity. We've heard that in Jean-Claude Juncker's speech. I thank you very much for this new start, and I'd like to thank the Commission as a whole for the work that it has done for our continent. Trust, colleagues, can only be generated through deeds. The Paris Climate Agreement, CETA, better border protection, growth in Europe, reduction of unemployment. Well, it's true that a lot of people are faring better in Europe today than in previous years. And we are delivering. And when I say we, I mean the European Parliament, which is the People's Chamber of Europe. It is something that we are delivering. It's only through our work that there is a Juncker Commission. The first political commission is the child of this house, of this democracy in Europe. And that's why I think we can be proud of what we have achieved together. The Parliament and the Commission are working together, moving in the same direction. As far as the EPP is concerned, I welcome the ideas set out by our President, the President of the Commission, for deepening the European Union. The world is not resting on its laurels. It's not waiting for us. We have to make progress ourselves. I, as far as the EPP is concerned, wants to take up the cudgels for Europe, for people. People are worried about globalization, they're worried about unemployment, they're worried about social dumping, and we have the idea of a social market, safe jobs, secure jobs, a decent wage, a fair wage, property. If you have property, it means certain obligations. We need to be able to stand up to the large players. We are saying yes to world trade, but we want to protect our core industries. We want to protect the social standards in the European Union. The European way of life is a social one. And I would like to see us as the EPP in the centre point of that. A lot of people are worried about the images that they see, illegal immigrants that arrive. They don't believe politicians anymore when they say this is good for us. They are worried. They're worried about their culture. They are worried about their identity. And that's why we need to do all we can to protect our borders, to police our borders. It's not a case of building up a wall around Europe, but illegal migration needs to be stopped. The European way of life helps people when they are in an emergency situation, when they need help, but this doesn't mean to say that we should be helping people traffickers, that we should be helping illegal immigration. Integration means as well that the values and the traditions and cultures of our societies are respected. State citizenship in Europe should be linked to these values. Anyone who does not subscribe to those values should leave Europe. Another concern that is expressed by people is Turkey. A lot of people are shocked when they look at Turkey. It seems that arbitrarily people are being thrown into prison, change of the constitution, the rule of law has been undermined, Turkey is moving away from Europe, and people don't understand why Europe isn't doing anything. We are a European Parliament, and we've made it clear that we should suspend accession talks because we want to send out a signal that we cannot continue along these lines in these circumstances. And Jean-Claude Juncker, I think people are worried and concerned that the Commission and the Parliament and the European Union as a whole is not taking sufficient action or speedy action.
In Barcelona, Turku this summer. Many say that Islam is a danger. During the attack on Charlie Hebdo in Paris 2 years ago, a French policeman was executed by the terrorists. His name was Ahmed Merabet. He was a Muslim who gave his life to defend the freedom of journalists. Dear friend, it's not a conflict between Christians and Muslims. It's a conflict between humanity and barbarism, between values and terrorism, between our European way of life and the madness of the terrorists. We must exchange our information now, immediately, and data protection must not be turned into protection of the terrorists. The European way of life protects the freedom of religion. It does not know the national egoism when fighting together against the terrible acts of the terrorists. And dear friends, many people, as a last perspective from the people's point of view, are afraid when they are looking eastwards. In some days, a maneuver of Russian and Belarusian army will start at the borders to our Baltic states. About 100,000 soldiers directly at our border. Many people are afraid. After the wars in Georgia, in Ukraine, in Syria, what is Putin planning now? Dear friends, the European way is to defend ourselves. And that's why the ideas of the European Defence Union are going in a good direction. We need them now, dear friends. We need them now. And this is also why we should stop Nord Stream 2. Our security, dear friends, has priority to making money. And finally, there are a few of other perspectives from people's point of view, what they ask us to do, and we have to give proper answers. Let's act now. But to all these points, I think there's a need to combine them, to bring them together. And that is, from a EPP point of view, to define and to defend in the future the European way of life. In the past, our founding fathers of the European Union achieved peace. They were successful because they believed in themselves. Today, dear friends, we must defend the identity of Europe. Today, we must defend the European way of life in a world that is changing rapidly. And we will also be successful. Let's start now. Thank you.
And now, in the name of the S&D Group, Mr. Pitella. Thank you, President Juncker. It's true, there is a wind of hope, a new wind of hope blowing over Europe, and citizens are beginning to have the idea that without Europe, they'll be more on their own and less defended. But we don't need to be idealistic about this. We've done well, but we have only got one bullet in the gun and we can't shoot it wrong. It is important that we ensure that a lot of the ideas for Europe are coming from our group, the socialist groups. We say that we have to transform the proposals into results. And as you said, let's be courageous with this. Let's strike all the multinationals who have defrauded the tax systems, meaning that they've actually used their benefits that should be going to the benefits of the European citizen. This is going to the exploitation of young people. Young people, even those with masters, end up earning 550 euros a month. This is a scandal. This is a scandal we have to oppose. We have to, as the European Commissioner, Mr. Timmermans, is doing, we have to look at the issue of freedom, equality, the rule of law, democracy. You said that these are the pillars of the scenario that you've painted. I would say these are the foundation. This is the very DNA of the European ideal. We have reinforced our decisional process. We ought to have a European Minister of Budgets. But this isn't just to be a kind of obscure guardian of the treaties. It has got to be a democratic institution that actually gives fiscal transparency. I say this clearly. We do not want a minister which actually becomes a kind of policeman. We want a minister which is actually focused on growth and work. We have to get out of the rhetoric of the 3 A's that are being talked about on social. Welcome to the social world, Mr. Weber. I'd like to say welcome to the EPP. I look forward to you pushing behind us as we have been pushing on these dossiers over the years in the areas of the competency of the Commission. We have to have a child guarantee for young men and women. No child should be left without education, without home, without food. This also applies to unaccompanied minors. They have also got to be given these things. We have to be more courageous when it comes to investment. We have to be more courageous when it comes to fighting climate change. There's Parliament's done wonderful work in that area. We have to ensure we can actually look at what's happening with the hurricanes. We have to be able to foresee the disasters. Europe has got to be a leader in this battle. And now, on immigration, thank you for recognising Italy. And I say this as a European, not as an Italian, but we have to do more. There has to be a revision of the treaty and the Dublin regulations, but the Socialist Group will not vote any decision without the elimination of if it gets rid of the country of the first safe country. It has to be legal ways of migration, and the blue card is an old tool. We have to have the courage to open legal routes for migration. That's the fair thing to do. But if we don't have these legal migration channels, we're not going to solve the problem. And that's why we have to have a partnership with Africa, which I would define as the partnership of dignity. You said there has to be money. Yes. It's very important that we ensure that there is funds. I think we need to ask the young entrepreneurs who are creating jobs and development in Africa. We have to have a proper cohesion policy. We have to have a budget with its own proper resources, and we have to think properly about the financial transaction tax. We have to, President Juncker, we have to say yes to transparency on the trade agreements. We're defending this in the interest of the citizen. We have to go over and above what's been done with CETA. The Socialists want to go over and above CETA when it comes to the protection of the interest of the citizen and the consumer. Thank you for your patience, but we have got a white page, and we can write this white page together. You talked about innovation. You talked about the huge progress, AI. Very often we talk about this here, but very often it's like we're kind of, discussing amongst the angels why the world moves ahead without us. What we can do and what we can't do, what we've got to do, we have to be part of this huge transformation that's taking place. Look at the Agenda 2030 for sustainable development. Let's just take that as an example. Let's work with that, with the love that you have in your heart, but also the commitment that we have in the Socialist Group to work together. Let's ensure we do this with reality and conviction.
A nome del gruppo.
In the name of the ECR Group, the floor now goes to Mr. Kamal.
Thank you. Mr. Juncker, when it comes to jobs, security and freedom, a Europe that protects cannot be a Europe that is protectionist. And the ECR Group believes that the EU needs to create more opportunities, not more regulations and more agencies. Many of our citizens tell us that they feel as if they have little say in the decisions we make about their lives, their countries and their futures. When it comes to their concerns over migration, security and jobs, they prefer an EU that complements their national and local governments, not seek to overrule them. Speaking as both a future neighbour who wishes to see a prosperous EU trading and cooperating with a prosperous UK, and speaking today as one of the leaders of the ECR Group with MEPs from across the EU, being critical of the policies of the EU should not be seen as an attack on the EU, but a genuine desire to see an EU which regains the trust and confidence of its citizens. As a Liberal Conservative, and a passionate believer in free trade, I welcome the emphasis on open trade in your speech. But modern open trade needs countries to shed the cloak of protectionism. Modern open trade needs to be open to the latest investment in technology to allow frictionless borders. Modern open trade needs faster broadband networks to allow SMEs to trade securely online with the rest of the world. And for businesses and our economies to thrive, let us prioritise the refit agenda. Let us improve access to finance for businesses, small and large, via peer-to-peer lending and crowdfunding. Let us train our workers with the skills demanded by modern digital economies. But also, let us unleash the spirit of free enterprise in our young people to create their own businesses. And let them be allowed to try and try again if at first they don't succeed. Because just as Soviet five-year plans did not create creative economies, EU growth plans don't create jobs. It's businesses that create jobs. We must also remember that our economic prosperity depends upon global stability, and we cannot show disunity in our dealings with Russia or other unpleasant regimes. We must maintain sanctions and show in words and in action at the Eastern Partnership Summit that for countries like Ukraine, NATO, the EU and the West can offer them a better, stronger and more stable future than turning to face the East. Mr. Juncker, no one expects there to be a quick fix to all of the challenges, or for you to have all the answers by the next time we meet. But the people outside of this building want to know that the people inside this building will continue to steady the ship and not set sail into yet more storms. So no matter what side of the argument or what side of the channel, all our countries need to prepare to face the global challenges from a position of optimism, from a position of strength, and from a position of honesty with our voters.
A nome del gruppo dell'Alleanza.
And now, for the ALDE Group, the floor to Mr. Verhofstadt.
Mr. President, first of all, Jean-Claude, what a difference with last year. I liked your speech, your State of the Union. I think it was full of vision, ambition for 2019, and quite a difference with last year. But let's be honest, between us, a lot has changed, in fact, in the meanwhile, in the Union last year. In August, for example, 2016, it was Mr. Hofer who said that he wanted to take Austria out of the euro and the union. And 5 months later, after his defeat, he said exactly the opposite. He changed his mind and he said, no, we want to stay in the euro and in the union. And then in March of this year in the Netherlands, it was Mr. Wilders who promised a spring of populism, and what he created, he reaped the opposite. It were the pro-European parties who won the election. And in France, exactly the same. It was Emmanuel Macron who won the campaign with a pro-European program. And since then, even the Front National doesn't want to exit the euro and the union anymore. And even in Hungary, Viktor Orban is piping down. He accepts now the authority of the European Court of Justice. And he said, I think 2 days ago on a radio interview, that no way that ever Hungary would leave the Union. So I want to say, in fact, at the occasion of this State of the Union, Jean-Claude, to Mr. Hofer, to Mrs. Le Pen, to Viktor Orban, welcome to the side of reason. Even when we know, all of us, that is not that they have changed their mind, it's not by conviction that they've changed their mind, but by fear of losing votes that they have changed their mind now. And the only way, or the only one for the moment, who still doesn't get it, I think, is Mr. Farage. He is still going on. He said last weekend, he called the German EFD to campaign on Brexit. I think it's a fantastic advice to campaign on Brexit. You have to keep up the good work, Nigel. I hope they take it, but unfortunately, I don't think that they are so stupid to do that in Germany with the EFD. And because, let's be honest, it's clear what our citizens want. They don't want to destroy Europe. They want to reform Europe. But to destroy it, no bloody way. That is the message of our citizens. And colleagues, and that is what I'd
like so much in the State of the Union this year by Jean-Claude Juncker, let's not make the mistake to think, okay, yeah, the war is over. We have won a few elections in a number of countries, and now the wind is blowing in the right direction. No, what the people want is not to continue with this Europe. They want the reformed European Union. 73% of our citizens want more European action on the side of migration. 75% want more European action against climate change. The same number want a European army. And at the same time, even more Europeans want European capacities and capabilities in the fight against terrorism. So it is true, Jean-Claude, that the last 3 years were not easy. It was mainly crisis management, but I completely agree with you that it is now the moment, now or never, I should say, like in the song, to build up that European Union that the people are asking for and that we together are already dreaming of for a number of years. And what does it mean? It means that we create a European asylum system so that we can finally get rid of this broken Dublin system, because there is the real origin of the problem. Dublin is not European. That's national egoism. That is Dublin. In fact, not Dublin as a city, naturally. So don't misunderstand me, because I'm going to have my Irish friends against me if I continue like that. A European border and coast guard and a system of legal, indeed, Gianni, migration, so that people no longer die on our shore, because every dead body that we find in the Mediterranean is a scandal for us, for Europe, even one death in the Mediterranean. A European defence union, so that it are not the Americans and the Russians who are in fact deciding, Mrs. Mogherini, in our backyard, what is still the case today. A European FBI, why? Because terrorists don't know borders. That's the reality, so why we continue to do so? And then also a real government for the Eurozone, so that we can steer the European economy and that we can create what, in fact, we are missing. European champions. It are our competitions rules who are too narrow. In fact, it is the fact that we have no unified markets with single regulators who make that we have no European champions that can become world champions and compete on the world level. But there is one thing on which I have a little difference of point of view with you, and that is on the institutional problem. I'm always thinking that good institutions produce good policies, and that bad institutions create, in fact, stillstand, stagnation, and crisis. And there are a number of examples of that. And that's the reason why we in this Parliament, and I thank you for the support, really, because it's very helpful, that we want also to create transnationalist and a real European constituency. And why we want to do that? Because it's time to lift the democracy to a continental scale. Europe, dear colleagues, is more than the sum of 27 national democracies. We are more than that. We are, in fact, a democracy on a European scale, also to defend our values and our principles outside the Union, but also inside the Union. This European democracy is necessary, for example, to withstand alt-right governments like we see today, also inside, in Poland and in Hungary, would think, in fact, that Trump, with his white supremacy, is the example. Or Putin and Orban would jail opponents is the example. Well, that will never be the example in whatever member state in the European Union. And for that reason, we have to create this European democracy with a transnational, in fact, responsibility. Because we need, as Emmanuel Macron has said it, near to the Acropolis, because we need to be the counterweight of all these developments and, yeah, autocratic leaders worldwide. A beacon of openness, a beacon of freedom, and a beacon of hope in the 21st century. Thank you, President, and thank you, Jean-Claude Juncker, for the State of the Union.
Per il gruppo.
Thank you. Now, for the GUI NGL The floor now goes to Mr. Eric.
Monsieur le Commissaire,
Mr. President, President of the European Commission, you have painted a canvas which does not represent what the people of the European Union are living through. You cannot paint a canvas made up of statistics. I'm afraid the workers who see their jobs are under threat, the small farmers who see themselves being priced out of the market, the unemployed for whom nothing is being done, these people see a different picture. And however many billions you place upon the altar, what can we actually say we have achieved when people can't make ends meet? That's the crisis in the European Union, the crisis that's sweeping through the European Union, because we are not listening to the people. We don't have the necessary social and environmental idealism. The Antilles, Cuba, and bits of the United States have suffered from a terrible storm. We need to fight climate change. The trade deal with Canada flies in the face of what was agreed in Paris. Europe needs to see social progress, environmental progress in transport, energy, housing, urban renovation, and farming. We need to change the systems of production. That would create thousands of jobs in Europe, and it would allow new training and research opportunities. All of that is possible, not by setting up a European monetary fund, but by turning the Juncker Fund into a real social and environmental development fund, which through the ECB would write off the debts of the member states and kickstart new projects to protect the lives and ambitions of all Europeans. All that the Greek government wants is for training programs for unemployed Greek people to be funded from the Juncker plan. Europe needs to stop being focused on competition. A social Europe with a minimum wage, doing away with precarious work, going back to job security, proper pensions, eradicating poverty, sharing wealth fairly, justice for posted workers, equality between men and women, more rights for people to take decisions in their companies, tax harmonization, fighting tax fraud and tax havens. That's what we need to be doing. Enough of this nauseating discussion of the refugee crisis. Let's have a proper Europe of solidarity. Let's have a development pact with Africa, and let's root out violence and war from the Middle East. It is high time to listen to the people. Democracy is knocking at the door. It's time to listen and let it in. What we need is a democratic, social and environmental renewal to take place in Europe, starting from the grassroots. The European Union should also help to reduce conflict. It should be in the vanguard of nuclear disarmament. And the European Union should certainly not beat a path of militarization, as is being proposed. It ought to be promoting education and culture instead. We want a debate, Mr. President. We want a real debate which will turn the European Union into a force of social progress, environmental progress, and peace embedded in democracy.
Per il gruppo.
And now for the Green Group, the floor goes to Mr. Lambert.
Thank you very much, President. Mr. Juncker, we listened to you very attentively, and I'm trying to put myself in the shoes of all my citizens, all our citizens that cannot go on like this anymore, that can't make ends meet, that are victims of the situation today, that aren't covered by social security, whereas the richest among our society get away scot-free. So there's a lot of problems here. They don't get jobs. Often there's more flexibility that is set out, but it's actually more flexibility, more protection for the people that hold the capital here. And also the fight against terrorism. This is something that needs to be tackled much more. They can't go on as it stands. People are just suffering too much today. A lot of the time, citizens attribute to Europe this scourge that they can't tolerate anymore. We do have a lot of responsibility to bear, but a lot of the time the Commission too often doesn't do enough. Of course, we can congratulate ourselves and be very pleased that Le Pen and Wilder and the like don't carry sway anymore. But a lot of citizens aren't really seeing the benefit of that. Also nationalistic ideas are also happening within your political family, Mr. Juncker. Look at Austria. So often this is called the Commission, the last chance Commission. But I think there's more to it than that. You need to ensure that European integration, you're trying to tell citizens that European integration is in their favour. Sometimes they don't understand that message. A lot of the things that you have said are music to our ears. The Eurozone proposals, this idea of transnational lists is something that we of course go along with. We've been pleading for that for decades now. But everything that you're suggesting here today is hopefully going to give us a jolt now. That's what we're hoping for. The other things that you could have said today, but citizens, you might be legitimately asking yourselves whether your democracy is actually working in your favour. Well, what we need to do is ensure that we reduce inequalities and ensure that our ecological pact is being adhered to. Our objective is to give everybody the possibility of a dignified life. How are we going to achieve that? Well, I am committed to ensuring that all legislation, all actions, all recommendations coming from my committee will be screened for these things, in reducing inequalities, making sure that the ecological balance is stuck to, this kind of thing. Our committee, my committee, will ensure that there is cooperation from the bottom upwards. We will ensure that we realign our trade policies. It's got to condition the access to our markets, respecting social standards, environmental standards, our healthcare standards that we have chosen. Also, we will freeze CETA, the application of CETA, and revise our recommendations for all the trade agreements in the offing at the moment. The internal market, that needs to be reworked. We are completely determined on this. We will be deleting glyphosate. We will be wanting to remove glyphosate and also endocrine disruptors. That is something that we are going to look at very carefully. Europe should be the tool with which we construct our European future. The only opportunity for Europeans finding their place in a world economy is to ensure that they are at the vanguard of developments that will help sustainability on our planet. So rather than defending the current order, our committee, my committee, will be supporting anything that goes in that direction towards that transition. We want a Europe in which nobody feels left in the cold. We need to assume our responsibilities. Also, vis-à-vis people that are banging on the door, asking for our help. We need a more democratic society. Democracy has been harmed when justice isn't adhered to, and when the universities and media are undermined. There needs to be very tight checks on this. Governments need to ensure that everybody is dealt with in the same way. It shouldn't be giving succor to the major players that contain all the capital in their hands. No, democracy is not something that is irreversible. We need to ensure, and you have said that yourself, we are the guarantors of the rule of law. We need to ensure that continues to be the case. The European Union is very rich, a lot richer than it was 60 years ago. It's more wealthy in all kinds of ways. But the only way in which we can take control of our future is to do this together. Mr. Juncker, by implementing this kind of agenda, I think you will have really grasped your final chance. I think you are somebody that will have put Europe back on track again, rather than being someone associated with other less favourable associations.
And now for the EFDD, the floor goes to Mr. Farage.
Mr. Juncker, that was the most open, honest and truly worrying speech I've heard in my long years in this place. The message is very clear. Brexit has happened, full steam ahead. So new plans. There's to be one powerful president for the whole of the European Union, a finance minister with fresh powers to, as you say yourself, intervene as and when he sees necessary, a stronger European army in a militarised European Union with a stronger and perhaps more aggressive foreign policy too, and more Europe in every single direction, and all of it to be done without the consent of the people. Your plan to fight the next European elections with cross-European, pan-European lists funded by the European Union, but not, as you said, to fund extremists, means what we will find is genuine democratic parties of opposition will not be able to compete in elections on the same playing field. It is reminiscent of regimes of old. Indeed, the way you're treating Hungary and Poland already must remind them of living under the Soviet communists when you attempt to tell them how they should run their own countries. All I can say is thank God we're leaving. But you've learnt nothing from Brexit. If you'd given Cameron concessions, particularly on immigration, the Brexit vote, I have to admit, would never, ever have happened. And yet, the lesson you take is you're going to centralise, you're going to move on to this new, I think, very worrying, undemocratic union. And you're deluding yourself, Mr. Verhofstadt, if you think that the populist wave, as you define it, is over. If these plans of Mr. Juncker's come to fruition, far from the populist wave being over, I doubt it's even begun.
And now for the ENF group, the floor goes to Mr. Wilimski. Thank you, Chair, ladies and gentlemen. We have to say these are apologies for European centralism. European Union is not Europe, and Europe is not the European Union. The European Union is nothing more than less than an association with certain rules, and you can change these rules. And to change the directions, well, we don't agree with it. I don't think you are allowed to make those decisions. It's the people, it's the citizen in the free voting system who are able to make decisions about the direction. And that's the thing. And what Mr. Juncker said today goes exactly against that. What Juncker wants de facto is to force the European Union into a single state. And we know that the euro is not a success story. We have extraordinary debts. We've seen the astonishing unemployment. We've seen the astonishing negative social impact on people's lives. We see this incredible social instability. The second thing Mr. Juncker wants is de facto to actually get rid of all the internal borders. We see 10,000, 100,000, millions of Africans and Arabs are going to be coming to our continent. Oh yeah, everything's going to be there, including terrorists. And we know that the people who committed the terrorist attacks came through these routes into Europe, and that is a threat to security for all citizens of our continent. And they talk about having a defence union. But no, we don't want that. What we want as Austrians, we're a neutral country in Austria. What we do not want to participate in the defence union. The right road for Europe can only be the road where there is more democracy left to the people, more democracy left to the citizen, where people can vote whether or not they want to have Schengen maintained or not, if they want to have their borders or not. The vote's got to be left to the citizen. The reality of having free movement at a moment of terrible unemployment, it's the citizen that's got to say whether or not they want that to be in place. That is what we need in Europe. Democracy, pluralism. You have to give more sovereignty back to the states if Europe's ever going to function. It doesn't work now, and you know it yourself. It would be good if we changed it.
La parola ora.
And now the floor goes to Mr. Papadakis.
The sixth scenario we heard for the future of the European Union is yet another attempt to find a compromise between the harsh competition that is going on within the EU and the Eurozone, where Germany has sprung far ahead from the other countries. At the same time, in all countries, all the governments are pushing ahead with very harsh measures against the workers. In Greece, in France, in Italy, they're relieving big businesses from taxes. You said some words about the EU becoming more powerful. It only means that the EU is in class against the United States, Japan and China. We cannot hide the fact that despite your talk about peace, the EU is actively taking part in imperialist wars. The EU is only becoming worse, and the people's discontent is growing every day. We need to overthrow the real enemy. Thank you.
Ora, a nome del...
Now, in the name of the Council, it's Masikas.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Speaking not on behalf of the Council cannot have a position on this speech. Speaking on behalf of the Estonian Presidency of the Council, I thank President Juncker for his ambitious, clear, and most importantly, a thoughtful speech. In this moment, with the wind in our sails, we should bear in mind a couple of lessons that the last couple of years have taught us. First, that we who care for our union must have the courage to make the positive case for EU. It's not only a right thing to do, but it also may pay off in elections. Secondly, we should not be afraid of speaking of the cost of non-EU, of the consequences of, so far, thank God, only hypothetical rolling back some advantages of European integration. Thirdly, we must keep looking for issues, initiatives and ways that unite us
and not those that pose the risk of dividing member states. We should look for initiatives that balance things and build bridges. For instance, it is much easier to talk about the EU's social pillar, something that the Estonian presidency will duly take forward, when we simultaneously take real steps in deepening the single market, in particular in the field of services. So not only better paid jobs, but also better access to these jobs. Fourthly, of course, we must keep developing the EU further. But doing this, we must not forget that this time around, in 2017, it is not the institutional setup that is most important. It is important, of course, but reshaping the institutions must go hand in hand with providing concrete benefits, concrete things for our citizens. Our citizens must be at the center of our attention, delivering concrete benefits for the citizens. That's what the guiding principle of the Estonian presidency is. Ladies and gentlemen, for the last several years, we have all been working on building a digital single market. The free movement of data is one of its cornerstones. We need to ensure that European citizens and businesses are able to benefit from data and that we create no new barriers to the single market. As with the EU's other freedoms, free movement does not mean a freedom from rules. Next year, new EU personal data protection rules come into force, and we look forward to starting work on the Commission's new proposal on the free flow of data. Thank you, President Juncker, for this proposal. Member States have repeatedly emphasized that legislation in this area is necessary. The Estonian presidency will move now swiftly, attempting to consolidate Member States' positions on the concrete proposal. As we grow Europe's data economy and enter the era of the Internet of Things, cybersecurity becomes a matter for everyone. We welcome the renewal of the EU cybersecurity strategy proposed by the Commission. Cybersecurity is a challenge that cannot be tackled by any member state on their own. We all need to fulfill our responsibilities by fully implementing existing EU legislation, must deploy all parts of our toolbox, working on the new legislation, engaging with the private sector. The EU also has an important role to play, setting international norms, pursuing cyber criminals, standing up for European values such as freedom and privacy, guiding the development of the global market for secure products and services, and reacting to states that sponsor and support malicious cyber activity. The EU's heads of state and government will address these key issues at the Tallinn Digital Summit, 29th of September. Ladies and gentlemen, I earlier listed some recent lessons for the EU. We have also learned that while strengthening the EU internally is of course key for the health and functioning of the Union itself, at the same time, to be and to appear strong, the EU also needs to remain engaged and open to the outside world. We are a model to a number of countries in our neighbourhood, and we should not forget it. The EU's transformative power is still very much there. The Eastern Partnership Summit in November is an opportunity to reconfirm our commitment to our neighbours' positive transformation. In the field of trade, the EU must perform a tough balancing act. President Juncker laid out very eloquently the elements of it. We of course welcome the message that we can now proceed with the free trade agreements with Australia and New Zealand and to expand the network of liberal trade relations in this globalized world. The Commission has gone a long path with its reflection paper on harnessing globalization and deserves to be commended for that. With regard to the proposals about investments and the multilateral investment court, as presidency, we will make our best efforts to proceed in the best possible way to build a consensus among the member states in a manner that will enable the EU to continue its leading role in trade policy. And now to migration, the crisis of which shook the fundamentals of the EU and showed that the EU does not really have a headquarters to manage an acute operational crisis. The EU doesn't have a general, if you will. This is not to say that we haven't achieved a lot in the field of migration. The work on the external dimension is ongoing well, and maybe for the first time, the Union is using all the tools in its foreign policy toolbox at the same time: assistance, development, trade, military operation, enlargement policy even. The Estonian presidency is working hard on migration issues, not least while carrying forward work with a common asylum system. On legal migration, we eagerly started working with the European Parliament on the Blue Card Directive. On security, we are ready to engage with the Parliament on ETIAS and hopefully on SIS initiatives. And of course, we are confident that an inclusive and ambitious permanent structured cooperation in the field of defence can be launched by the end of this year. Ladies and gentlemen, the speech by President Juncker and the debate we have had so far shows us once more that in our Union there is much more of what unites us than what creates tensions. Estonia, a country that was deprived of the advantages of the European integration during its first 40 years, feels that particularly deeply. That is the compass while we act as a member state. That is our compass, especially while we are performing the duties of the presidency of the Council of the EU, with the wind in our sails. Thank you.
Visti I tempi.
Now, because of the time restraints, we're not going to have any blue cards here. The floor goes to Mr. Caspary.
Sehr geehrter Herr Präsident.
Mr. President, 1 or 2 years ago, the mood here was somber. Commission President Juncker talked about a window of opportunity, and we should seize that opportunity. Manfred Weber talked about people's worries, for instance, about globalization. Give us some weeks to talk to the citizens. What we need to see is quick, transparent negotiations with Australia and New Zealand. We need to we need to reform our trade protection instruments and an instrument against external strategic investment, because we need to be able to protect our industrial base. Secondly, people are worried about jobs. Not least Germans, about jobs in the car industry. There's a crisis of trust, but we also, as we take climate action, we need to protect jobs, because we need climate protection, we need cars, and we need jobs. We can't have one and lose the others. And this is what has to permeate our legislative proposals in the coming months. And on the transnational lists, many people think that we're in an ivory tower here in Europe. We need to bridge the gap. We need to be closer to the citizens. Pan-European lists, in my view, will set us further apart from citizens, and therefore we reject them.
Onorevole Rodriguez.
Madam Rodriguez.
Welcome, Mr. President. This is a moment for us, as a last shot, to have a real vision and ambition. What is at stake for this legislature? It is indeed to develop the European house and to move to a next stage, a new floor. Is to make Europe not only as a single market or a Eurozone, but also as a political entity able to respond to the new world in front of us. We need the European Union as a big democratic power, supporting our way of life and making sure that we have the means to deliver our values and our way of life. This means indeed to have new means for peace and security, to manage migration, and to support development. But for this, we do need a new, brand new community budget for the future, based on new own resources, turned to the future, not to the past. And this means, when it comes on resources, that big corporations should pay their taxes because they must benefit from the single market, but pay what they do to pay. Then, if we have in mind a new democratic political entity, this can only be based on stronger European citizenship. First of all, respecting fully the fundamental political rights of our citizens, but also making sure that we can count on updated social standards. When it comes access to social protection, when it comes access to skills, but also making sure that everybody in employment, whatever the kind of jobs they have, they can count on a decent labor contract and this access to social protection. This should be the ambition of the upcoming European social pillar. But can we say that this Europe as land of equal opportunity, of fairness, is being delivered to all European citizens? We don't think so. Europe is still working as a machinery for divergence and inequality. And we need to reverse this very undermining trend. So we call upon the Commission to come up with an ambitious proposal of community European budget, turning European project a project for equality and convergence. And this should apply for the European Union as a whole and also for the Eurozone. So this is our request for the upcoming work coming from the European Commission.
Vi prego di rispettare.
I'm asking people to please stick to the time that's been given to you, because otherwise we will end up cutting time from other MEPs who wish to participate and catch the eye. The floor now goes to Mr. Lucke.
Herr Juncker, Sie haben
Mr. Juncker, you had 60 minutes to build illusions, castles in the air. You've awakened illusions that really have no realistic basis, that don't really tackle the problems that the European Union is facing. You talked about the reality of the European Union, and you talked about fish fingers, vaccinations, cocoa content of chocolate. But what about the major problems that need to be tackled in the European Union? You haven't offered any solutions. You talked about the rule of law, but you didn't talk about the breach of the Maastricht Treaty, that the fiscal pact has been infringed several times, the Dublin Pact, that all of these things have been violated, that monetary state funding is still being carried out. These illusions, you are giving succor to them. 220 billion euros that have been generated, but the banks are saying there's not actually any project that we wouldn't have funded anyway. So you're not addressing Europe's real problems, and the European Union will not get out of the crisis in this manner.
La parola all'onorevole Telička.
Another floor to Mr. Telička.
Thank you, President. President Juncker, not bad. In fact, not bad at all. I think that this is something that I can very well work with on the Czech domestic political scene. We have spoken about your life having been a fighter. Of course, me on a different level. I've been going through a similar experience in the Czech Republic. And I think that with this vision, with these ideas, I'm happy to confront some of your former counterparts, politicians that have views of the first half of the 20th century. So thanks for that, even though, of course, some disagreements for sure, but that is absolutely normal. Let's forget the 5 scenarios. I think that we both know that 3 of them were no scenarios at all. And I think that if we have now the priority agenda, I would have wished maybe that you have shortlisted 2, 3 more, but I understand that we will find them in the report. But I think that the implementation of these priorities, the reform agenda that you have put emphasis on and that I subscribe to, will lead us to the outcome, and that is the 6th scenario, so the European Union that we want to have. Maybe someone will fall behind, but that, of course, remains to be seen. Final remark, unity. I believe, as you do, that we are in a better shape. But if we have still a problem, that is lack of unity in the Council, lack of ability of the Member States to deliver on what they have even proclaimed themselves before. One final remark, President Juncker, I'm not offended that you have forgotten the Czech Republic as a country that will also be 100 years old next year. No offense. Thank you.
Now, Mr. Kari.
Thank you, Chair. I must admit, I find it arrogant, Mr. President, that you say that things are going in the right direction, because that's not the view of our citizens. They see poverty, they see deterioration of their welfare, they see their salaries under pressure, they see high unemployment, particularly youth unemployment, and they see an EU that doesn't solve their problems but makes their problems worse. They see an EU that does not listen to them, but instead of looking at the real problems, you sit there with the rest of the EU elite in your glass tower saying you want more EU, more power to the EU Commission, a finance minister to control the member states even more in the direction of the Commission, a president over all presidents to make sure we have one union with one president. I find it arrogant towards our citizens and towards our democracy, and honestly I think that this Commission has plenty of powers already.
And now the floor to Senor Terry Cabras. President Guyana, Mr. Juncker, I'm going to talk to you today in Spanish. Surprisingly, you didn't mention the situation in Spain with the upcoming Catalonian referendum, because hundreds and thousands of Catalans have been asking for a referendum on autodetermination, just like the Scottish. The Spanish government never wants to speak about this or hear about it. The Catalan government has approved by a majority the law of the referendum, as if it were in fact a crime to have referendum. A court case has been brought against the president of the Catalan Parliament, and also against over 1,000 local civil servants who are working in favour of the referendum. These are unacceptable attacks on freedom of opinion. I'm not asking that you actually fight for independence. The Catalans can do it on their own, but I do ask that you actually require that the Spanish come to an agreement on the referendum. Why does the Commission not intervene in order to defend the freedom of expression in Spain? You do it in other countries, would you not? Thank you very much. And now the floor goes to our colleague Lundgren.
Full steam ahead.
Thank you. Full steam ahead is what we've heard. It reminds me of the Titanic, that film, that scene where the captain stands on the bridge, looks at the seas, looks at the oceans, and doesn't see an iceberg and says, right, full steam ahead. We all know what the fate of the Titanic was. Now, people in Europe aren't really interested in this kind of vision anyway. In these visions that you've set out, Mr. Juncker, they want tangible solutions to their very tangible problems on a day-to-day basis. But you don't seem to manage to do this. Social dumping is one example. The future of our young people as well. Those are the kinds of things that citizens want responses to, but they have just remained vague visions and dreams. More Europe, more federalisation is what you seem to be pleading for. But really, it's the other side of things that we need to talk about in the next few years.
Mr. Bay, Mr. Juncker, this Parliament has still ridiculous as it was last July for you. We already know the lack of respect that you have for the people of Europe, And now you showed that day, in fact, the contempt that you also have for the representatives. You don't just actually have contempt for the MEPs, but also for the heads of state and government of Hungary, Poland and Slovakia, who stand up against your ideas. Mr. Juncker, you said a moment ago that Europe is an aging continent. You said you wanted to set up some new roads for extra-European immigration, even though that, in fact, is what caused the profound identity, security, economic and social disorders that we're dealing with. You try to actually distinguish legal immigration, which you want to encourage, from clandestine immigration, which you want to fight, without ever giving yourselves the resources. Now, these two kinds of immigration don't cancel each other out, they accumulate. We have to give hope and confidence to the people of Europe. We have to get their own demographic dynamism. You have to give them the mastery of their own destiny and build a Europe which is built on cooperation. That's our vision. That's against your vision. Yours is federalist, rigid and totalitarian.
La parola al...
And now the floor goes to Mr. Sonnenborn.
Präsidentin.
President, colleagues, probably more presidents here than colleagues at the moment, but never mind. In the last 3 years as an MEP, I have achieved a great deal of work. I sent away the Brits, I dethroned Mr. Schulz, and I also ensured that Helmut Kohl was moved somewhere else. And also there's the Polish PIS party. I've tried to teach them democratic values. And I'm particularly proud that the EU has taken on board an original idea that we had, namely a wall around Europe. Just recently, going along with the CSU, we asked for an upper limit for refugees. Germany shouldn't take in more every year than the Mediterranean Ocean. Now the Mediterranean Ocean is full, so the idea is to construct a wall around those failed states, Chad and Mali. And I would like to say sorry to foreigners here, because a lot of decisions were deferred until after the elections in Germany. Just another week and then the party will start governing again.
Mr. Weber, you have a point of order.
Sehr geehrte Frau Präsidentin, wir sind hier Parlament.
Madam President, this is a parliament where we have freedom of speech, and everybody is entitled to say what they want. However, to speak of the deceased, as Mr. Sonneborn just has in the case of Helmut Kohl, that is a matter for the Bureau to deal with. It is completely undignified and unacceptable.
Thank you, Mr. Weber. We will look into that matter. I now give the floor for 1.5 minutes to Mr. Lewandowski.
Dziękuję. Thank you. There's a different climate in Europe now. We had a very different State of the Union speech in 2017. This was not technocratic optimism. Last year we were shocked by the UK referendum. We thought that there would be a rising tide of populism. Instead of shock, though, now we have shock therapy. And it's not Europe that's in the shadow of Brexit, it's the United Kingdom. The great creation of the founding fathers is going to continue to flourish. We have scenario number 6. This is good news. There are some exceptions to the good news, though. My country, Poland, is also going to be celebrating 100 years of regaining independence. My country, Poland, is inhabited by people who feel good in Europe and about Europe. They feel themselves at home in Europe. I'd like to say on behalf of my delegation that we'll do everything we can to ensure that Poland will be a full participant in the quest for a new European unity. Thank you.
Thank you. Madam Fayon, 1 minute, please.
Hvala, predsedujoča. Spoštovani predsednik Juncker, čestitke.
Thank you, President. I would like to congratulate you on your speech, President Juncker. Rule of law, young people, and the Western Balkan area. These three things are very much close to my heart. You talked about the rule of law, and you said that court judges should be enforced. You talked about, countries shouldn't be able to decide themselves which judgments they enforce or carry out or not. What about some countries that aren't doing this? You need to look at that, Mr. Juncker. And then how do young people get any faith in the European Union? They see politicians not really responding to their problems. They are unemployed, they don't get jobs. In the Western Balkan area, there are problems. You said you wanted a credible enlargement policy, but that's not happening because it's a playground for geopolitical interests. We're going to have second-class citizens if we're not careful. We need to invest in Europe that is not a continent of intolerance, hate and walls. My biggest wish is to ensure that we can breathe fully. Thank you.
Mr. Urban Crespo.
Señorías, la crisis.
Ladies and gentlemen, the crisis in Europe started in 2008. Mr. Juncker, you will finish your job in 2019, and this in fact will be seen in history as a lost decade. It'll be a decade of austerity in Europe. The European Union is not in fact moving forward. It's not a problem of speed, it's actually a problem of political will. With your speech, you insist on continuing on the same road that has brought us to this situation. It's a federalist vision. What you're doing is you are creating an anti-democratic machine which in fact leads to blackmail, financial blackmail, in order to impose a neoliberal vision that has already proved it doesn't work, and which ends up falling on the shoulders of the European population. The problems in Europe aren't going to be solved by new trade associations. More externalization of our borders isn't going to help. More budgets for defense isn't going to help. This is going to lead to more austerity because these are responding to the interests of multinationals, lobbies and government. What we need is a change of direction. We want a 180-degree change of the external policy, ecological policy, environmental policy and social policy. That's what we have to do. We have to work from the ground up. This would be a real change.
I'm following the instructions of the President, who really asked us to respect our speaking time. 1 minute now for Mr. Valli, please.
Sì, grazie, Presidente.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Mr. Juncker touched on very important topics: security, immigration, economic aspects. I'd like to focus on economic aspects. The European Stability Mechanism and turning that into a European fund is something that's quite difficult to understand for some people. I think it's quite easy, particularly with regard to what the European Finance Minister has suggested, namely a structure, namely the Troika. It would mean that member states would give money to the ESM and would receive against that they would receive reforms. That's the idea, that as a counter they would receive reforms. But I'm not sure that will really work. There's the quantitative easing idea that has also been put forward, but we've got Germany that isn't assuming its responsibilities. It's not accepting true euro bonds or fiscal transfers. So it's all these structural, undemocratic problems that will continue to support intolerance and sufferance, and this is completely unacceptable.
Thank you. Mrs. Atkinson, 1 minute.
Pleased that you think everything in the EU garden is rosy. There's no mention of the 50,000 jihadis waiting to blow us up that are going through your failed immigration policies. No mention of your failed immigration policies and the marauding migrants breaking into our countries. At least the Eastern European countries have got the right idea. No mention of your failed youth employment schemes. But there is good news. In the UK, we have record employment despite Brexit. We've got record inward investment despite Brexit. Volume of output is the highest in 20 years, despite Brexit. And Bill Gates said that despite Brexit, Britain still can lead in the science and technology institutes. And our order books are the highest in 30 years, despite Brexit. The City of London is still #1, despite Brexit. So sorry to invade your space, Mr Juncker, but you and the EU and your ideas are really past their sell-by date.
Monsieur Prost, 1.5 minutes.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President, all too often we are weak, as in the case of our reaction to the court judgment on Singapore or the failure of multilateralism. The fact is we've now seen a new development in globalization, economic planning by foreign powers, dumping, hostile investment, the acquisition of strategic companies, strict rules on our companies operating abroad, unfair competition and the lack of reciprocity. There was no agreement yesterday in the trialogue on dumping. I don't think this is a failure, because we need to have a clear political message, especially as regards the burden of proof. Europe needs to protect itself without lapsing into protectionism. That's a clear message. Our treaty requires us to be extremely cautious in terms of our legal obligations, hence the uncertainty. The ambitious draft regulation will at least save us walking on our heads. We've lost time, and in reality we're losing jobs, we're losing know-how and technological advancement as a result of a country that's organizing its investments and private and public companies. We're not against foreign investment, but we're against strange investment. We need to make sure that we don't end up with future Apples or iPhones assembled entirely in China.
Merci. 1 minute, Mr. Stanishev.
thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, President Juncker, for your speech. I know you are a deeply convinced European, and in your sixth scenario, I don't see Europe which is divided or several-speed Europe, which is very positive. But at the same time, you know that people are tired of words and promises, and it's time for action from the Commission as well. And the strongest tool which you possess as a Commission is the project, the draft of your budget for the next multi-annual financial framework. We should stop thinking how to reduce the European budget, but look for own resources. We should really focus on political priorities. And the major priority is how to move from Europe of divergence, inequalities, towards Europe of convergence and strong economic growth and social justice. I expected, frankly speaking, stronger social dimension. We really need a European social action plan today in order to regain trust. Thank you very much.
1.5 minutes, Mr. González Pons.
Vientos favorables, señor.
Well, favourable winds, that's true, Mr. Juncker. We've left behind the euro crisis, and now we've got to also move this positive atmosphere onto social protection and works. I liked what you said about the rule of law and equality. Sometimes it seems in Europe that it's more important to us to solve the financial crisis than the political and social crisis that we face. Here we talked about Brexit as if it were just, going to be another free trade association. Actually, starting from this, it isn't just about European Union defending the idea of Europe. What we've got to do after Brexit, we have to see that there will in fact be two different Europes inside our continent. I share your points of view when it comes to the role of courts as regards the European Court and national courts. This is in fact one of the very founding reasons of the European Union. There are countries that are attacking the separation of power, and that's what's happening in a region, in fact in my country, where nationalism is now attacking the constitution. Nationalism is expanding just like a virus. The constitution of each member state is in fact the building blocks of the European Union. The unity of my country is also the unity of the European Union. This is why the European Commission has also got, and I share this, a responsibility to defend defend the constitutions of all of the member states and to defend the unity of the member states. And the rule of law is born out of the individual rights, but it grows and develops if you follow the law and the courts. Thank you.
Thank you. 1 minute, Madame Thomas.
Merci, Madame. Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much. I'm very disappointed, I have to say. First of all, your last chance saloon hasn't really worked. You're not giving us a battle plan for the end of the mandate. You're giving us a strange way ahead, a strange route ahead for the future. There are a certain number of priorities that we could go along with: social, tax and public freedom. But these are all words. Moving from words to deeds, as you said this morning, we need a serious budget, and that's my second disappointment. You're saying you want to break out of the straitjacket that exists now, but what about this 20% ceiling? Nothing definite about that. Own resources, nothing about that. Multinational taxes, nothing there either. Fiscal justice is something that we really need to focus on, and that hasn't happened. So I'm very disappointed as well about economic and monetary democracy. There are new prerogatives that we want. What we need is to ensure that we can choose economic ways forward and break out of austerity, but you haven't given us the chance to do that. Thank you.
Madam Gardini, 1 minute, please.
Thanks, Madam President. Mr. President, you've set out a model for the future of Europe, and I can share a lot of the things you've said, starting with the protection of Europe's strategic interest. Some analysts think that this is the most important geopolitical aspect of your whole speech. I want to say something about the reform of the Treaty of Dublin. That's a priority for our group, and it's unavoidable if we want to back European industry, starting with small and medium enterprises, youth unemployment. But let me just say one question in my brief remaining time. Europe needs more democracy, you've said, but you didn't say anything about that. This assembly, directly elected by our citizens, doesn't have legislative initiative rights. Don't you think that should be on the agenda? We need to get the wind in our sails, as you've said, and we can do that if citizens really see that they're at the heart of everything we do in Europe. Thank you, President.
Thank you. 1 minute, Madam Garcia Perez.
Thank you, Madam President. For years now, Europe has stopped being part and parcel of our dreams, and the idea of our project, which is equality, opportunities, has become something altogether different. Precarious jobs, austerity, economic crisis. Today, those of us who believe in the European project will agree that there are grounds for concern, that we need to move ahead with new policies for the European Union. The European social pillar must be a priority. It's simply not possible for a 21st century Europe to continue to have a working class that lives below the poverty line. Let's talk about the fight against climate change. Let's face up to the fight against terrorism, asylum and immigration policy. These are of fundamental importance. Thank you, Mr. Juncker, for mentioning the rule of law. Europe is a project based on democracy. Therefore, it's fundamental that we guarantee a respect for the constitutional order of each and every member state. There's no time to be wasted. We need to get on with it and tackle these changes. Diversity, dialogue, respect, cohesion. This is what defines Europe. Let's not allow anything or anybody changes this. Thank you.
1 minute, Mr. Sugar.
I most welcome with the emphasis you placed on the idea of Europe, the community of values, Mr. Juncker, that the need to ensure freedom, equality and rule of law all over the EU, so that there would not be second-class citizens anymore in our integration project. Still, European citizens belonging to national, autochthonous or language minorities can be treated very differently depending on where they live. Only last week in Romania, the Hungarian minority language Catholic high school of Târgu Mureș ceased to exist because the systematic harassment of various authorities, where hundreds of minority language speaking children were at insecurity until the last moment about whether they would be able to attend their school again. What do the parents of these children who are interrogated by the Romanian Anti-Corruption Agency for enrolling their children in the school feel from the rule of law that the EU is supposed to guarantee them? The EU still has a long way to go to ensure its values and prevent discriminative practices. More than 60 million citizens expect acknowledgement of their existence by the EU institutions. Thank you.
Mr. Weidenholzer, 1 minute.
At the moment, we're in a curious situation in Europe. We've got Trump, we've got Brexit, but thanks to that, people are more positive about the EU. But it's not all good. We're a long way from having solved the migration issue. And the improvement that in the economy that you have mentioned isn't benefiting everybody. Parts of Austria, for example, aren't seeing that. And there's also more of a disparity now between East and West. You know, I'm happy to see Mr. Timmermans here taking a very clear line. The Commission is the custodian of the treaties and has to guarantee the fundamental rights as a result. But it's this openness to dialogue that I'm not seeing in those who are trying to benefit at the expense of Brussels. How to act against that? Well, Brussels has to be better, more democratic, and act in a more social way. And I think you've given us a good basis for that.
Madam Vălean, 1 minute.
Thank you, President. Congratulations for your strong messages in your State of the Union today. For the first time in years, our citizens show growing faith in the EU and its direction. Their confidence is justified proof that the EU remains where they put their hopes and where they want to live and prosper. For all this, we are obliged to keep our word and deliver on what we have promised. Some will say we need more ambition. I say we need stability, consolidation, and proper implementation of EU policies. We need to defend our values to make sure our citizens can fully benefit from their rights and freedoms, and that the competitiveness of our companies is both defended and supported. Yet, the engine of our internal market is not fairness, but competition, and it has to be a real one. You can't send people home saying, go compete in your own country while we protect our national markets, because the internal market, it's not the sum of national markets. The State of the Union should also be about how we can offer more Europe for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Madam Mosca, 1 minute.
Grazie, Presidente.
Thank you, Madam President. President Juncker, trade policy is one of the most powerful instruments we have. And although obviously it can't sort out everything, it needs to be continually updated and improved to meet global challenges, which are constantly in flux. I was listening carefully to what you were saying, particularly about transparency, but I think we should really stress 3 points. First of all, trade is still a genuinely European policy, open, democratic, without sacrificing the need for us to pull together. That's why the Union needs to be ever more closely involved in all phases of the process and not simply Parliament's assent at the end of an agreement being reached. Secondly, sustainable development, if the chapters on that are going to be effective, they need to be binding. I'm glad the Commission's done what it's done, but it needs to continue thinking, bring it into real practice and providing sufficient money, and Parliament's willing to help on that. Thirdly, it's vital because opening up in terms of trade is based on fairness and reciprocity, and we can't have these waivers depending on who the partner is. That will threaten our whole economic system. Thank you, Madam President.
Mr. Rangel, 1 minute.
Caro. Madam Vice President, Mr. Juncker, my dear President, first of all, my compliments to you for today's speech. Thank you. I think this gives a new fillip to us. It encourages all of us who love Europe, like Mr. Juncker. Now, there is a challenge which is not one of your immediate concerns, at least not those we heard today. This year, there was a wave of forest fires in Portugal with tragic consequences. There have been floods all over Europe, including recently in Poland, with tragic consequences. Last year, there were earthquakes in Italy. There have also been earthquakes in Greece. And with climate change, there are going to be a lot of these catastrophes. Would it not be time to create a European civil protection force? Now, this, of course, ties in with internal security. Could have missions in the Mediterranean, rescue at sea, this kind of thing. But when this kind of catastrophe supervenes, we should get out there, help national forces to mitigate the consequences of such catastrophes. I think it's high time to create a European civil protection force, and it would be the embryo of what could eventually become a real European army. Thank you.
Mr. Bullmann, 1 minute.
President Juncker, Sie haben
President Juncker, you've given a speech which meets up to your own expectations. It was sober, and we've heard that the East needs the West, but also vice versa. And I think the same goes for North and South as well. I've never been quite as revolted as the time when I had to read in the German papers saying, if you want coal, sell us Corfu. I mean, this was quoted from stupid politicians. And I'm very glad that you never got dragged into that debate, but you stood up to it. I know that that's not the level at which you operate, but we can't say that economic policy in Europe depends on who's in government where. Whether there's a Greek haircut is a technical issue. It shouldn't depend on whether or not your political allies are in government in one country or not. We need a policy that can help the South to develop, but we need the South in this very difficult period the world's going through.
Mr. Kovachev, 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam President. I'm pleased with what you've told us, Mr. President. Now we need to achieve the goals that you've set. We need to be effective in the European Union because it'll be our fault if the European Union is ineffective. Next year, the EU needs to demonstrate that the promises to keep its citizens safe are going to be met. We should focus, therefore, on things like cyber security, control of our external borders, and solidarity to be shown with states where there are a large number of migrants entering. I like the idea of a cyber security agency, Mr. President. We also need to continue to help Europe recover economically and maintain its social standards and its public health standards. Also, we need to help those sectors where the crisis has hit us hardest, and we shouldn't allow any part of the European Union to be neglected. I'm glad that you're thinking about we not have a two-speed Europe. That's the most important thing. Thank you.
Mr. Bostinaru, 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam President. Domnule președinte,
President Jean-Claude Juncker, I would like to thank you today for the courage, the vision, and the wisdom of your speech, but moreover, for the force to oppose those who favorize the division of Europe and the double standards in the project of Europe with several speeds. On behalf of the Romanian delegation, on behalf of my political group, and on behalf of my country, I share your vision and I commit myself to supporting you. If I analyze your speech, Europe can be an important player in matters of security, Only if we are united, only if we speak on one voice, and only if there is complete trust among all members. If we look at the cohesion policy, it is fundamental to implement the principle of solidarity and to reduce all disparities. And this is why I would like you to give attention to the continuation of this fundamental instrument of the Union. Union and solidarity means that there are no double standards in cases of enhanced cooperation, that Schengen cannot be refused when there are conditions which are fulfilled, and that the CVM cannot be continued unless it is necessary. And the quality of food is the same for all Europeans. Thank you.
Mr. Niedermayer, 1 minute, please.
Thank you, Madam. And thank you, Mr. President, for your speech. It is good to remind us about how things have changed since last year. Just to remind all of us, growth is up, unemployment down, employment up, stable financial sector, improved fiscal policy. And this is just economy. You mentioned more. You can say these are just numbers. These are not just numbers. This means that life for people in Europe is better. And this is what people expect from us also. As you know from your past, a good time is exactly the time where people are making a lot of mistakes. And you urge us to not make mistakes in this good time and instead to do many good things. And I agree and I appreciate that. One of the obstacles that I want to stress is still missing trust. Trust among politicians, trust among people, trust among countries. I hope that in next speech you will remind us that this has improved. This is very important. And also at the end of your speech, you mentioned that we shouldn't be overcautious. This is exactly the way how to make the mistakes and to miss the opportunities. I hope we will not miss them. Thank you very much.
Thank you. 1 minute, Madam Van Bremt.
Dank u wel, voorzitter. Commissievoorzitter Juncker.
Thank you very much, Mr. President of the Commission. Your speech was optimistic. Perhaps not fully fledged optimism was expressed, but the general tone was optimistic. And it's something I think we can support with a fair degree of enthusiasm. Transparency, climate protection, the climate of industry, ensuring that there's more democracy. We completely agree. However, we were still left feeling that there could have been. We want a AAA on the social issues, 3 years discussion on social dumping and no results. Look, we need to ensure that everybody in Europe obtain work in the same conditions and receive the same salary. There's got to be proper social security enshrined in European legislation, and we'll be measured on our action, particularly on social action. Thank you.
Thank you. Madam Ulskog, 1 minute, please.
Fru talman, herr
Madam President, Mr. President of the Commission, thank you for what you've told us this morning, Mr. Juncker, and thank you for having talked about better standards for the labour market. These better standards will be crucial for the whole of the EU. We need to take positive measures here. Nothing divides us more than social dumping, which means that workers are set against workers and sell their labour as cheaply as possible. That's a disgrace for Europe, and there are many of us who are focusing our hopes on you to improve the situation. We need to have some kind of overseeing authority, but also legislation, a directive and legislation on the social market. That can't be done, the labour market, sorry, that can't be done from outside. We need a social protocol. Thank you. As you said on the Eurozone, we think you need to respect countries which don't want to take part, such as my own. That needs to be respected, that decision. Thank you, President.
Colleagues, we now move to catch the eye, and I will disappoint more people than I will please. So with that remark, I will try and give the floor to as many as possible, but probably around 9 colleagues. So immediately, for 1 minute and very strictly, please, Madam Spiraki.
Thank you, Madam President. President Juncker, the citizens are waiting for us directly to show we don't like populism and extremism in Europe. We need to come up with rational, correct solutions. We can't, it seems, provide well-being for everybody. We need to make sure, however, that we encourage our citizens and reward as many of them as we can. We need to keep Europe safe from terrorism, and we need to have a European information service which will help that goal. We have large numbers of migrants, and member states need to look to their own responsibilities here and need to be sanctioned if they don't. The Greeks and the Italians are facing the brunt of this crisis, Mr. President, and we need to make sure that cuts in the budget for things like research don't hamper the situation still further. Thank you.
Aguilar.
Señora Presidenta.
Madam President, President Juncker, in your home straight, you've given us your longest speech with the most intentions. We want actual solutions, legal ways in, not just this blue card for selective immigration. We want humanitarian visas, decent jobs for young people, fight against poverty, particularly child poverty, fight against inequality, tackling fraud and tax havens. We've seen all of this in the Panama Committee. But above it, it's all about rule of law. Ignoring court rulings is being in breach of the law. It's a crime, and that can happen in Hungary, in Poland, and Catalonia. Anyway, it's a negation of Europe. We're about the rule of law.
Thank you. 1 minute, Mr. Marias.
Thank you, Madam President. President Juncker, your 5 scenarios for change in the European Union have now put forward a 6th one, where we continue with the same policies, the same institutions and the same balances that existed before. A German-dominated Europe, austerity, and the Stability Pact. It's the anti-democratic Eurozone, the uncontrolled Eurogroup running the European Central Bank. It's bankocracy and a series of people-friendly measures are being brought in. Outsourcing, and we can see Europe's industrial base being undermined and European salaries being reduced. So Europe of unemployment and marginalisation of young people. And this, of course, has been worsened by 1 million migrants and illegal migrants. What we need to do is combat unemployment and poverty, and we can't do it by failing to deal with the huge migrant flows which are existing at the moment. We need to do something to protect the European family. Thank you. Ms. Bilbao Barandica.
Señor Juncker, como puede...
Mr. Juncker, as you can see here, my party, the PNV, organised or celebrated the National Basque Day in 1932, saying Basque Country, Europe. So I like a lot of proposals, but what about women who suffer inequality and violence? We need proper support for plans, and we need to protect and empower people. We want a social Europe that's open, refuge, united against terrorism, more industry, support for the real economy, economic and political capacity, the single energy and digital market. We are victims of the short-termism of member states, democratic values, the rights of everybody, including national minorities that do exist. And as in Catalonia, instead of recognizing that reality, you prefer to just stifle everything without political action dialogue. We have a European problem. The intergroup on minorities in this Parliament has called for dialogue. Democracy is going to be imposed, but nobody should hinder it either. Nobody should hinder a political solution to this problem.
Onorevole Sirikiotis.
Mr. Sirikiotis. Thank you, Mr. President. The Union today needs to remain stable and at the surface of its citizens. We need to make sure that there are plans to increase unemployment and improve labour conditions, particularly in those countries which are living under memoranda. But you're just offering the same thing again, keeping the regional imbalances and unfairnesses in place, Mr. President. We still have poverty pockets in Europe. What we need to do is not spend money willy-nilly in the defence fund. We need to make sure that there's real economic growth on Europe. We need to make sure that there be some proper way of dealing with the refugees, not simply some agreement put together with Turkey. We in the left want to see a different kind of Europe, getting rid of poverty and inequality. We need more public expenditure. If we are going to create decent jobs, we need a social Europe, a Europe of solidarity and peace. We need a Europe in the interest of its citizens. Thank you. Ms. Lunacek.
Danke. Herr Kommissionspräsident.
President of the Commission, the Greens' slogan about EU is remain critical, but remain. We want an environmentally sustainable union so that citizens can believe in it again. Cosmetic changes are simply not enough. You've made a few interesting suggestions, but when it comes to trade, it's still the interests of the big companies that are being put to the fore. The balance is not as it should be in a democracy. What we want, what we need, are fair trade agreements. Otherwise, there's no point in talking about why refugees flee their homes. What you said about the rule of law was good to hear. And I also was pleased to hear you say that you, together with the European Parliament, will be looking at the funding of European parties and foundations, and to change that funding so that right-wing extremists can't fill their coffers in order to knock back the European principles. But it's not enough to describe the State of the Union. We have to change the imbalance and make the EU credible again for all EU citizens.
Ms. Morvai.
Thank you very much. Mr. Juncker, in your position, I think it's a very good idea to watch television every now and then. If you do so these days, you can see really good news from Syria and from Iraq. The wars are almost over. Rebuilding has begun. Refugees are returning home. Don't you think, and please answer this question, don't you think that it's high time to fundamentally reconsider the relocation and resettlement quota idea of the European Union? Stop bashing Hungary, stop preaching us about solidarity, and talk about solidarity to those strong, healthy, young Syrian and other men who should go home and rebuild their countries. That is solidarity with those nations. Thank you very much.
Onorevole Cristoforu.
Mr. Cristoforu. Thank you, President. I welcome the speech of the President of the Commission, and I'm particularly pleased that he focused on the core values of the European Union. We need to look at freedom, the rule of law and equality, Mr. President. That is what Europe is based on, and that's what the basis for a strong Europe, giving well-being to its citizens. And we shouldn't have agreements with countries like Turkey who don't share our European values. European citizens should feel proud when they take part in the freedoms which Europe has given them. And don't forget, we couldn't deal with countries which don't simply fail to respect human rights at home but have seized territory in my own country. It's important that we remember this and Don't simply allow the customs union to continue in the way that it is at the moment. We have values in Europe and we need to protect them together, Mr. President. Thank you.
Costa.
Ms. Costa.
Presidente Juncker, grazie.
Thank you, Mr. President. President Juncker, thank you for what you've said and your genuinely European vision. It's something which could put the wind in the sails of Europe again and help young citizens, particularly young British citizens who are going to be suffering the impact of Brexit, when we need to look at sustainable development, defence, foreign policy, more justice. We can play a role in the world, and that can only be guaranteed by more Europe, free, fair, united also in terms of the priorities that it has and the values which it shares. If we're going to do that, we need to have a cultural and educational dimension of the European project. They need to be leading elements on. 30 years on from the beginning of Erasmus, let me ask you whether we can't think about doubling the number of young people who are eligible. That's still only 5% of young Europeans. That would, of course, require a doubling of its budget. The European Cultural Heritage Year, which you mentioned, that's going to begin in Milan in December, along with our new cultural diplomacy. Ms. Mogherini and Commissioner Navracsics are behind that. That's a tremendous opportunity for us to share and disseminate our values and promote intercultural dialogue and developing Europe's social cohesion and creating quality jobs. Thank you very much. Mr. Smecker.
Dank u, voorzitter.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. Juncker. Well, we keep on talking about a democratic Europe, about recovering the hearts and minds of our citizens, the trust of citizens. And the fact of the matter is, MEPs, we are close to our citizens. After all, that's how democracy begins and works. And I have to say that I agree with what the Catalan colleague said last week. Hundreds of thousands of Catalans filled the streets of Barcelona with colour. And I think we need to develop their European future. We've got to do that democratically, and we know full well that the problems between Barcelona and Madrid have gone to court, and that civil servants have been given orders to boycott the referendum. There has been intimidation in the media and elsewhere. You're aware of that, and as a Fleming, we can't accept that. We want a Europe of citizens, and we want for democracy to flourish and be respected.
Mr. Hundis, last speaker in Catch the Eye. Thank you, President. President Juncker, the situation in Europe isn't really as you described it. Workers look at the union as something which is reducing their wages and rights. Pensioners see nothing but further cuts in their pensions. Unemployed people see the carrot plus in terms of investment, but the stick of the weakening of legal protection and threat of job losses. Your comments and what Mr. Macron said recently show that you're violating democracy, particularly in my own country. You're ignoring the wishes of the Greek people expressed in 2015, and your commissioner has said that the Greeks trying to end austerity in their own country as a scandal. This is simply not fair. We need to work together in terms of the industry and the environment, but we need a Europe of peace, not simply a Europe of war and aggression. Thank you.
Bene, grazie a tutti.
Thanks very much to all members who took part in the debate. I now turn to Jean-Claude Juncker, President of the Commission, to reply to the comments which have been made. Jean-Claude, go ahead.
Monsieur le Président, Mesdames, Messieurs.
President, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues. I spoke, I believe, for more than an hour. It was no mean feat for you. It was even more difficult for me because I have a rather painful sciatica. have to rest up, I'm afraid, so I won't be able to answer you in great detail. But what I will say is as follows. The Commission, where it's already taken initiatives, it will continue to work towards making legislation. For example, on social issues, the Council and the Parliament have seen a whole range of initiatives submitted to them. And I don't need to list them here because those texts have been forwarded to you. So it's not the Commission, if you like, that is responsible for the seconding of workers directives not having been reviewed yet. And indeed, I think the same would apply to a number of other proposals. You would do well to read the letter of intention that Mr. Timmermans and I have sent to the Parliament's President. Over a number of pages, we describe in detail the Commission's intentions. And we would like to involve the Parliament and the Council very closely in the work that will be done between now and the 24th of October, and after that, that being the date when the work programme for the Commission is adopted. And I hope that we'll be able to work together harmoniously. And I hope that we'll wrap up the year with a joint declaration on the work programme of the three presidents of the three institutions, and I apologise for having to leave now.
Grazie Jean-Claude,
Thank you, Jean-Claude. We can send a doctor round, if you like, who can take care of you so that you can always be at full strength and answer all of the questions that we have. I'd also like to thank Vice President Mogherini for the extreme endurance that she showed in plenary yesterday. Now the final round of speeches, ladies and gentlemen, and the first speaker is Mr. Synadinos. Thank you, President. I listened to what you said, Mr. Juncker, very carefully. And it sounded as if you were promising paradise to us in Europe. But if you look at what the present European Commission has done, is produce unemployment, poverty, migration, and it's failed to address any of these problems, as well as the possible entry of Islamist terrorists into Europe. We need to have a more people-centred approach to Europe. People are not happy with the way things are going, and we're fed up with the disastrous results of your globalised policies. We have democratically elected governments in Poland and Hungary, and they are governing in the interests of their people. The Greeks, the Poles, the Hungarians, including the Brits who voted to leave the European Union, don't want more or less Europe. They want a more democratic Europe, a safer Europe, and one that respects national sovereignty and respects other member states. Thank you.
Onorevole de Graaf.
Mr. de Graaf.
Voorzitter, wie zegt dat het beter gaat met...
Mr. President, some seem to be saying that things are getting better in the European Union. They're closing their eyes or living in Never Never land. Islamist countries are sending large numbers of people to our shores, and every day men or women and children are raped by immigrants in our cities, by immigrants of Islamic origin. There's no safety or security in the European Union, and this Parliament is full of bleeding hearts. You're still closing your eyes to the dangers of Islam. And you're spending millions for the Coast Guard and defending our borders, and it's not enough. There's a problem of debt, there's a problem of unemployment, and the European Union is losing market share internationally. So things aren't going great in the European Union. In the interim, the UK has taken to a lifeboat and left the Titanic. Eastern countries are engaging in, and countries near us are engaging in all sorts of dictatorial acts and witch hunts, social failure, economic failure, security fit. Mr. Juncker has done a runner, so really stop with this electoral propaganda and just stop this project, which has just been a failure.
Mr. Paxas.
Pone pirmininke, prasidėjus antram pasauliniam karui Britų parlamentaras Leo Emery.
Thank you, President. After the Second World War, the British MP Leon Emery criticised the British government and said that Mr. Chamberlain had crumbled. Now, you have spent far too long here. Go. Get out, he said to Chamberlain. I don't want to say the same thing to Mr. Juncker, but I would just remind him of it. Those who had tried to teach lessons to the countries of Eastern Europe should stop. Now, I myself am not much of a seaman, but I don't think one can rely on the wind to reach top speed.
Mr. Le Yarrick, in today's debate, President, we didn't hear any self-criticism about the impact of austerity policies imposed on ordinary people. And there's no way you can move forward without a new social project. Secondly, we've heard a lot about democracy, but I think that the combination of a single president in the Commission and the Council, we don't know who's going to appoint this person, and transforming the Stability Pact into a European Monetary Fund, when we know how the IMF works, the International Monetary Fund, is a very worrying development, because we're going to see simultaneous centralisation of power and stricter oversight of member states' budgets, so there'll be more austerity. There's nothing good to come from that quarter, and the idea of that being a more democratic Europe is simply not correct. Thank you. Mr. Verhofstadt.
Can I just say to Mr. Lear, the most important thing is that we ourselves can choose our leaders at a European level. We can choose our national leaders. That's the most important point. And I hope that the GUI will support the idea of transnational list, which will express this dream. Will have the ability to decide who leads Europe.
I have only two conclusions, President. Mr. de Graaf says it goes bad with the European Union. I think it goes bad with the populists and the nationalists in the European Union. He makes a mistake. Problems are in his movement for the moment, not with the European Union. He's even saying that, there is no increase, for example, in the number of jobs. Well, everybody knows that there is an increase in the numbers of jobs in the European Union. And my second conclusion, Mr. Timmermans, is that hopefully you have seen here in the center of this House a broad support for the programme, ambitious programme that Mr. Juncker has presented. And you have to take that on board and use that as a tool towards our member states and to the Council, so that from their side there will be also the same ambitious and support for that ambitious programme. Thank you.
Onorevole Legutko.
Mr. Legutko.
Nie ukrywam, że jestem.
Well, I won't hide the fact that I'm a little bit surprised that President Juncker didn't say much in terms of the conclusions to be drawn from Brexit. I mean, I think that Brexit is a great loss to the Union, And if I did think that, I would expect the president to tell us what he'd done to balance out Brexit. On the other hand, he didn't say that it's good and it's a success. I don't think it's a success. I think it's a failure. Now, Mr. Juncker has said he's suggested a number of scenarios and that there's been a discussion and a debate. What debate? A debate is when you don't know the end conclusion, but we already have a conclusion. Now we've got a fait accompli. These conclusions are just more of the same old, same old. More Europe, more Europe. Is that a solution? Are we really being treated seriously when you tell us that? Is this really a debate? A debate means putting forward arguments and replying to arguments. Just recall the expressions used to describe those who are of a different point of view today. We heard idiots, viruses. We heard extremists. We even heard them being accused of taking money for their views. Is that a discussion? If it carries on like that, we all know where we're going to end up. More Europe, one president, one minister to do this. Everyone's been saying, let's keep going forwards. No, let's not keep going forwards. Let's look at what's happening. Somebody's quite rightly said that it's not true. That breaking rules only applies to them others. It happens here too. It happens within the EU. Rules are criminally contravened by institutions of the EU, including the European Commission, which also itself breaks rules. People are also addicted to double standards here. There are parties and institutions that are allowed to do whatever they like and get away with it scot-free. And then there are the weaker players in this game who aren't allowed to do much at all. Let's clean up put our own house in order first. Let's begin with a renovation. So the Commission, let's begin by getting the Commission's house in order. And then we can start thinking of building wonderful other institutions. But let's first of all cure the illness that is raging in the European institutions at the moment. And as quickly as possible, please.
Visto che questo è un dibattito di...
Given the importance of this debate, colleagues, and that we have been flexible in terms of speaking time in the debate, theoretically the Greens have used up all of their available time, but if Ska Keller or Mr Lambrecht want to say something for 1 minute, I'll give them the floor.
Oui, je reçois une minute gratuite. C'est le jour des...
I wasn't even up to date of how it was looking in my account. That's very kind of you, President. Mr. Timmermans has stayed around. That's no bad thing. Mr. Timmermans, I've listened to what your boss has to say. I know what he wants to do. He's saying about that there'll be a Europe with no second-class citizens, right? But today, some of our citizens have to keep on eating products which you don't want to ban because of better regulation. There are high rises on fire that have been on fire, like in the UK, because we don't want to do anything about anti-retard or fire retardants, and national standards are good enough. So simply, quite simply, I would ask the Commission to make a gesture and heed the words of your boss. Thank you.
Ora la parola all'onorevole Gianni Pittella.
Now, Gianni Pittella for the S&D Group. Thank you, President. I believe that a Europe which works is in the interest of its citizens. A Europe that doesn't work properly runs counter to those interests and simply increases citizens' disaffection. Let's be honest, there are forces in Europe and in this House which are working so that Europe doesn't work properly, so as to gain from this back home. It's the exact opposite of what we want. We want a visionary project for Europe, a Europe that works and responds to the problems of its citizens. We want a parliament that has legislative powers. Please, what kind of parliament in the world doesn't have the possibility of proposing legislation? There's no parliament in the world like this, apart from the European Parliament. That would help citizens, that would help democracy, if that were to be the case. Secondly, transnational agreements. I am happy to work with the EPP as far as transnational lists are concerned. It's a new form of European democracy. A president of the Commission directly elected by the citizens and the president of the Council, the same two-hat principle. That's a good idea in this case, but without being voted on by the people, we have to be careful. The people's participation needs to be guaranteed. A kind of European federal system in terms of the economy, a European federal bank, all of this needs to be hedged about with European culture, because European culture is what holds Europe together. It's a dream, it's something we want, but also a political program. For us, it's the utopia, but a possible utopia. Thank you. Mr. Weber.
So, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen,